Da 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 ding dum dum bum 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 bum. Hello everyone, how are we doing? Hello. Let's get some iron brew. I've got some somewhere. Actually, out of iron brew, that'd be terrible. I'd probably be running crying from the building. Okay, let's see. Hello everyone. Let's see who we got. Who've got here to see? We have Carmen Gasberg. Hello John Shea. Hello Graham Highlander. Hello Knight 6831. Hello Bijon. Hello Peter Dawson. Hello Sean V. Hello Jonathan Burrow. Hello. Ooh, hello. Hello Wasaski. Hello DG40. Hello DH89. And hello Seneca Nero. Carmen Gasberg. Knights Cameron. Hello. Have you watched Drain the Ocean Season 3 Episode 2 The Atomic Ghost Fleet of Disney yet? I don't have Disney yet. But, you know. I have seen it. I've seen parts of it on other things. So I have an idea what you're talking about, 96831, but that's not today's topic, but I do have an idea what you're talking about. I think you'll enjoy it. I think you'll enjoy that one. Hello, Kenrick Johnson. Hello. Sorry, Dr. Locks. Could get some major tax breaks in the UK if he started a church at a sacred biplane in his home. Don't keep saying that. My accountant's now starting to get the idea. I think she says it to wind me up, but, you know. Hello, Off License. Hello, Key19. Hello, Colin Cameron. Just here for the first half hour, then I'm off to share a meeting tonight. Good luck. Sharing a meeting. I'd probably be calling in sick. So, Nick Nero. So I was just listening to Bill Trump 74. Yeah. The world is a fun place. It really is. Luckily for 75, we have a guest hopefully organised. I will say hopefully because we have a track record of guests. We booked them, they're coming, and then something terrible befalls them. Right, so tonight's discussion. The Maritime and Strategic Lessons of the 7 Years' War. Now, I'm going to do something slightly different. In that, once we get through the background setting slides, it's just going to go on auto. It's just going to click along. It's just going to be your friendly pally clicking along. It's not going to be necessarily related to what I'm talking about. Or it might be. But the reason I'm doing that is because I wanted to basically have above me something showing you all the various naval and maritime battles. And this is not really technically all of them, because there is a siege in India where some ships are heading to it, and by the time they get to it, the French naval officer in charge of the town, which is under siege, has surrendered, and so the army's got in there. And it's a case of, it was going to be an amphibious operation, it was going to be a combined op, but no, okay, fine. On to the siege of Madras. Damn, be careful about declaring religion, or you could be banned from going to Germany like they did to Scientologists. I'm not planning on doing it. It's just my accountant proving that she watches my videos. It's like I've got friends who are literally coming back to me and talking to me and commenting on the video of me and Drac. And I think there's a couple actually been commenting in response to some of the more the regular viewers' comments. They've actually been responding to them. It's fun times. It really is. So, here is an overview of the 7 Years' War. And I know some people are going to immediately point out to this and go, that's what Churchill said. It was the First World War. And there'll be other people go, well, that's Churchill, so that must be wrong. To be honest, Churchill wasn't the only one who said this. Lots of people made the case, and there are some wars before which could be classified as a world war, but this one is one which really does start to hit the classification points. Now, it's kind of a strange war in that you have France, Austria, Saxony, Sweden, and Russia are theoretically aligned on one side. Prussia, Hanover, and Great Britain on the other side. You must remember, Hanover is technically ruled by the same people that rule Britain. So you're considering them separate countries, but they're, to a large extent, one command structure. Also involved at various points, the Portuguese, the Dutch East India Company, not the Dutch, the Dutch East India Company, the Spanish, and many other interesting parties. Now, the standard thing is that it arose because of the attempt of the Austrian Habsburgs to win back the rich province of Silesia, which had been taken from them by Frederick II during the War of the Austrian Succession. But the trouble is, Silesia is a very small part of the war. The war actually expands dramatically. You have campaigns going on in North America. In fact, Britain and France have already been at war with each other in North America for 2 years when this happened. But apparently, you can be at war with each other in North America and not be at war with each other in Europe. Who knew? And that, of course, had been started by a 22-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Washington, who ambushed the French at the Battle of Jumonville Glen. And in India, I'm going to say this frank, okay? As far as I'm fairly certain, the Dutch East India Company, the English, later British East India Company, and the French East India Company, or whatever we're going to call it, are concerned. Peace is basically defined as when you're not able to call up your nation state armed forces to back you up in a firefight. Otherwise, you're always at war. And honestly, that's the big difference, and I would argue the big winning difference of the British East India Company out in India and etc. the whole way through this is because the British East India Company recognizes this and starts organizing its military, and I mean its local military, on a far more professional, far more organized, regimented, uniform level. And it has someone in terms of Clive who will do the admin and all the other stuff behind it to make it actually viable. However, if you look at this map, that is pretty much everywhere. There are fights and that are involved in the conflict. And then someone turns around to me and goes, well, it can't be a world war because it doesn't involve enough of the world. And you go, really? John, how was your day with Drakenfell? We have done quite good days together. We went together today, I think, as far as I know. Evening, Captain Seafort. Hello, Wayne Borean. Hello, Seneca Nero. Seneca, wasn't the 7 Years' War basically 3 wars which take 7 years each, 2 of which don't overlap? Not quite, and really, honestly, once you start getting into those wars, it becomes a 9-year-long war, which is far less catchy, because let's be honest, 9 Years' War versus the 7 Years' War. 7 just sounds cooler than 9. 1987, would the 1950s rebuild plans for Vectress Victorious be stored in National Archives? Yep. Well, they're more Greenwich. Hello, Duxon. Hello. Hello, off license. Hello, Rowan Cash. Hello, Sean Mac. Good to see I've got admins on this evening. I think I'm gonna need them. Sean Mac, peace is when you only have your private army. Okay. So let's start off with what's Britain like at this point. Well, Britain is its usual. I can't use that word now because it apparently makes fun of mental illness. But I mean it in the truest sense, so I'm going to say that anyway. I'm not meaning to attend it to offend anyone, but schizophrenic self, in that it's in 2 minds and literally has 2 personalities. One personality is represented by Newcastle, who's the Prime Minister and who has the support of the King, which is one reason why Pitt didn't manage to keep his Pitt the Elder didn't manage to keep his first ministry going, because the King didn't want to support him. And that is a continentalist view. That any war, it doesn't matter what happens on the periphery. Doesn't matter. War will be decided by the armies in Europe. And then we will tell the rest of the world what to do. It's a very Eurocentric perspective, but it comes to the fore occasionally. And then you have Pitt, who's going for a global strategy. We want a navy, we want to use it, we want to do amphibious operations, we want to go after their colonies, we want to strip them of their finances. And it's kind of interesting because the trouble for Newcastle and the Continentalists is that's fine if you're a noble who wants to go and fight for honour and glory, then going and fighting in Europe makes sense. And it's the King who wants to protect his Hanoverian territories, because he's also the Elector of Hanover and he doesn't want to lose anything. So yeah, they have a reason for it. But the rest of the British economy is going, well, hang on, that doesn't make us money. But going and taking French colonies, that does. Protecting our trade around the world, that creates it. And so there's a problem in that there is this mindset and group who believe that fighting in Europe is the key way to be. And that's how you're a great power. And that's how you decide things, by fighting in Europe. And there's this other group going, well, yeah, but that costs money, whereas this one makes money. So it's the continentalist versus the maritime global strategy. And this goes through many names, this lower strategy over time. Now, if you're talking about the modern perspective on it, well, how do I put this politely? The modern perspective on the maritime strategy is this: the British way of war. Because it really starts to take off in the 7 Years' War. That's when it starts to get really viable as a strategy and works as a strategy. But it's also been around for a little bit longer than this. It doesn't suddenly come into existence in the 7 Years' War. Karen, watching the sword fighting vid made me think, does Drac know Terry English, and is Dr. Clarke getting a set of full plate to wear to teach his more rounded classes? Whilst I wouldn't say no to having a full set of plate, the day I need anything more than my sheer force of will and personality to run a lecture hall, no matter how many hundreds or thousands students are in the room, is the day I give up being a lecturer. Because trust me, I am a nice, friendly guy on YouTube. I am pretty much friendly in my classes. But they also know they don't muck around with my classes. Because I will kick them out. Hello, Furry Kitten. Hello, Right Sublet. Hello, Rapinoni's back. Milton, you're always at war. Sounds like today. Well, pretty much. This is another interesting thing. When you're talking about these sort of strategies and these sort of time periods, there are two mindsets you can approach. There's the mindset that, oh, that's exactly like today. And there's the mindset of there's nothing to learn because that's happened so long ago. And the reality is we should probably take it as somewhat in between. Because there is something to learn. You're always at war. And the admin stuff matters. Now, I'm going to talk about one particular part about the British East India Company this time. So, Clive of India, Robert Clive, is out in India 1744 to 53, which of course is technically outside of our time zone, our time period. Then he's out there 1755 to 1760. So that's kind of like the first 6 years of our 7 Years' War. Or 9 years it might have been. And then he's out again 1765 to 7. There is no surprise that during the time that Clive is out in India, you have these leaps in professionalism going on in the East India Company forces. Because as they start out, they're originally a force of watchmen. That's pretty much their job, is to just be almost police. Security guards, which are heavily armed, to protect the factories, which have become fortresses and all sorts of things of the East India Company. And remember, factory is an old name. It was at this time a name for trading place. Now, in 1748, there is a Major General Stringer, Lawrence, appointed. And his purpose, his mission in life, is to professionalize the East India Company's troops. And he does it. Sometimes he's still given the title of the father of the modern Indian Army. I'm not sure about giving him such a title. I don't think it was what he was aiming for. But he was aiming that those troops out there would be as thoroughly well trained and thoroughly drilled as any European army. In fact, he completely did not get the memo that sepoys were supposed to not be as good as European troops in their drill. In fact, he often held his troops to almost higher standards. They were certainly held to higher standards of discipline and organization. And he made sure that they had the armies they needed. In 1750, all these troops are grouped from their individual companies into 3 operational armies. So you have the overarching Stringer as the C&C, responsible for everything, making sure appointments are sensible, making sure the officers are keeping to their standards. He was strict on the officers as well as the men. And then you have the 3 armies they're grouped around: the Bengal Army, the Madras Army, and the Bombay Army. And each one starts to develop its own culture. And this is actually a very sensible approach. A, because at this time there isn't easy communication between the three. It's mostly by sea. Secondly, it allows a level of competition to be grow up between the forces, and each one to develop their own local identity. These forces included European regiments, and by that I mean there are regiments which are battalions which are entirely composed of European personnel. However, as time goes on, and especially through 1757, when Clive hires, well, with Stringer's suggestion, and Clive's, happy to do it, Clive hires and raises the first 6 battalions, which are 6 proper battalions of sepoys. Up to that point, they had been, the locals had been added in an ad hoc fashion as auxiliaries. Now they were raised as their own functioning battalions. And they grew this up. They had some professional cavalry regiments. They had some locally raised cavalry regiments, which were more fluid in, let's say, their structure. But each army had its own artillery, its own cavalry, its own infantry. And the thing is, this is actually quite useful. And this is useful for the British government for 2 reasons. One, it kind of works for the British government like British and French orders did for the Americans in World War II. In that someone else is footing the bill to expand the production facilities of your arsenals, to expand the production facilities of your shipyards, of your musket production. Because that's what the East India Company's having to do. They're buying muskets. They are buying artillery. They are buying uniforms. They are buying all this stuff and equipping an army. And that's great. Because A, it means the British government doesn't have to send out troops there themselves. B, it means there's a very large army in India to do the jobs you need an army to do in India. And C, it's paying for infrastructure to be built back in the UK to support it, which is infrastructure which the British Army itself and the Royal Navy can leech off if it needs to. So this is great. Vision, where did you sword fight? We went and did our fight here on the Epsom Downs. Excellent. That just should open at random. YouTube has apparently decided I'm watching this. I'm glad. Now, the most coherent, consistent policy of any nation at this point is that from Prussia. Because if anyone has taken to heart that the Louis XIV's point of view of lesser roi, of that, I am the state, it's Frederick the Great. Who, of course, as many of you will know, is the one who really kicked off the War of Austrian Succession because he didn't like the idea. Well, his official line was he didn't like the idea of a female ruler of Austria, but his real thing was he wanted to get the German states under his control and form a super Prussia. He wasn't. He was not a German nationalist. He was a Prussian nationalist. Please, let's get this right. Frederick the Great wanted to build the largest possible state that he would be king of. He didn't care about any of the rest. And one of the interesting things about him is that he is completely happy to be... Well, he will say one thing because it suits his purposes, and then when his purposes change, he will say the complete opposite. He will both decry female rulers and give alliances to female rulers. He will say they shouldn't be in charge, and when they're on his side, they are God's divine right to rule. He has absolutely no qualms whatsoever. Bismarck, eat your heart out. This is who you wanted to serve, isn't it? It is. It's Frederick the Great. And for starters, let's get into 7 Years' War. Traditional alliances here, right? Prussia is the traditional ally of France at this point. Yes. They fought alongside France during the Austrian Wars of Succession. Austria fought against France. Russia fought against Prussia, so fought against France as well. And guess who propped up Russia and Austria? Britain! Okay, so this all sounds great. However, Britain wants to do an agreement with Russia, treaty of Russia, defensive one, that will protect them, their lands in Hanover, from being invaded by the Prussians. The Russians think this is a treaty of offense against the Prussians, when the British decide they don't want a treaty of offense because they only want a defensive treaty to protect Hanover. And the reason they want Hanover protected is they want it protected from Prussians and possibly French invasion. But the Russians don't want to do an alliance against the French for possible invasion against Hanover. They want to do an alliance which is an offensive alliance against the Prussians. The British then agree an alliance with the Prussians called the Treaty of Convention of Westminster, because Britain didn't like the phrase treaty. Britain doesn't like the phrase treaty. It's a convention. It's the Entente. It's so many things we don't like calling it a treaty. And so they do there's a treaty, a convention with Prussia, at which point France and Austria get upset because they feel that Britain and Prussia have stabbed them in the back. So they do a treaty of mutual defense called the Treaty of Versailles, the first one, at which point Russia also gets involved. There's also a Russian-Austrian treaty, which is to basically take Silesia back from Prussia. Are you starting to get a common theme going on here? There are a lot of treaties and negotiations, and we haven't even got into the joy of French foreign policy yet. We haven't. This is what's going on. So you can start to understand why people in the 1900s were looking at all the treaties going on, all the different agreements, all the different meetings and diplomacy going on, and thinking, I've just read Julian Courbet's 7 Years' War. My God, does this remind me of something? I'm afraid so. Did any of these theorists have practical experience? Because the nicest way, we should take theory from someone who has no practical experience. Should we take theory from someone who has no practical experience? The thing is, and I would say this with all honesty, there is certainly a group of practitioners who will argue that. But then I will turn around and go, well, Courbet is one of the greatest theorists of all times. Doesn't have practical experience. Because in a nicest way, it's a strategist's job and a theorist's job and coming up with strategy and developing these things. It's quite often it's historians, etc., who are using their studies of looking at what past have happened in the past, and trying to put these things into a context. Machiavelli was a theorist. Sun Tzu we can go with. We can go with many different theorists through history. I would argue that you tend to know the good theorists because they're the ones whose theories have proved attractive and interesting and persuasive and well enough put that they have managed to persuade not only politicians but practitioners as well. And also I would argue that when does a practitioner have the time to sit back and write theory and do the study necessary, especially these days? To come with strategic theories and working through it takes a long time and a lot of effort to work through it. To think about the examples, the context, the nuance takes a long time. There are a few who are both. Richmond, Cable. You've got them all got different services. I would say with Corbett as well, I would add that people like Fisher and Jellicoe and BT, well, not so much BT, rated him very, very highly. BT hated him by the end because Corbett was writing the official history of the First World War, and he wouldn't edit it to make BT look like a god. Operator, I see what Senior Shamack, I see what you're saying, but I think the threshold qualifies as total war moves with the times. It does to an extent. Cameron, the interesting thing about the East India Company Army is its officer corps is similar to the rebuilt Portuguese army during the Peninsular War, filled with experienced former British Army sergeants. Yes. It's very effective, though. Run Cash, what sort of numbers do each of the three armies had? We're talking well into the thousands, tens of thousands. We don't have quite official detailed figures until about 1800. And then we have roughly, well, the presidency armies of the East India Company are, by 1824, they are at 200,000 troops in 170 sepoy and 16 European regiments. What we do know is that probably about this time is they're getting up to around about 50,000, possibly more, with each army getting between 15 and 20,000. They have by this point. Roughly, though, because for some reason the East India Company doesn't officially report these things. Now, France. Okay. France. How do I best explain France and the 7 Years' War? They don't even know what their own king is doing, let alone their own foreign policy. They are all at sea. They are in a strategic maelstrom. They have no idea what's going on. They react to Prussia doing a alliance with Britain, which is a thing which it's a treaty which I will go through the specific wording of it, which basically says as long as France doesn't invade Hanover, the Prussians aren't committed to doing anything. And the French reacted this by signing up to Austrians and basically giving them a blank check. It's kind of like a reversal of World War One, where Prussia is France and France is Germany. Let's put it this way. Strategic lesson of the 7 Years' War, which no one really took to heart. Never give Austria a blank check. Mm-hmm. Nice to clear on. Are there any 7-year war wrecks around? They're mostly wooden ships, but there are probably a few war wrecks around. You can probably find their cannons in some places. Oh my gosh, Epsom Downs. It was a lovely place to do our sword fighting. Mac, the British will never give up. They will fight to the last Austrian. Sometimes something. Rather is it? Frederick Great is either an opportunist, a pragmatist, an opportunistic pragmatist, or a pragmatic opportunist. I'm not sure which. I go for his pragmatism always outweighs his opportunism. So I'd go for pragmatic opportunist. That's a great takeaway from KFC, Doc. Yes, mainly because instead of cooking today, I took the puppies for a walk because it's going down so cold this evening. So I had some food to cook, and I was going to cook, but if they're not going out later this evening, I took them for a longer walk earlier, and to prepare everything, it was a case of, okay, no food. All right, take away it is. Raparosa, I would think the practitioner would become the theorist in retirement. Honestly, in my experience, most practitioners in retirement want to stay as far away from theory as they possibly can. I've had this conversation. And as Colin Graham Handler says, many didn't live long enough. A few go to. So, the French East India Company, or, and I feel it's good to try and give out its proper name, so excuse the French. The Compagnie Française pour le Commerce des Indes Orientales. Now, I have a little bit of a reason for why this company doesn't tend to do as well as the British and the Dutch. You see, the Dutch moved in and took over the Portuguese. The English, later British, moved in and took over pretty much everywhere else, which was decent. And the French turned up and tried to turn into a good thing. And as you can see, there are lots of fleur-de-lis around India at this point. And there is this lovely map where they claim it. And they claim all those territories. And it was founded by Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was the Bismarckian figure for Louis XIV. And that's all wonderful. But here's the point. What do you really control? Because if we look at that map up there, they have lots of little flags up. But they're all down the coast. And so they're claiming they control all the dark blue area and all the pale-ish, sort of, the darker green, pale blue, whatever color that is, area was controlled by their allies and therefore is under their control as well. As, to put in the words of Clive of India, really? You control it? The thing is, they get dissolved and activities absorbed by the French crown in 1769 because they're going bankrupt. Then they're reconstituted in 1785 and they go bankrupt in 1794. If you're wondering in history when the British East India Company went bankrupt, it came close. It came really sodding close, but it never managed to. But all of this is nothing compared to Louis XV. How not to do foreign policy 101. I'm going to have an official foreign policy, which is going to be carried out by ministers, and my official foreign policy, my foreign office, and my ambassadors. And you know what? I'm going to do a secret foreign policy, which I'm not going to tell anyone else about, other than my very close friends who I'm going to run it through, which are going to be unofficial channels, where I'm going to take a completely opposite line on some occasions and a completely different tact. But I'm not going to tell anyone about this. And then people call Britain perfidious Albion. For goodness sake. It's a case of, why? Louis XV seems to forget he's the King of France. And yes, he does have some legitimate reasons for this. He wants to support his cousin to become King of Poland and all sorts of things, and he doesn't want to upset the Austrians while doing it. I can understand that. But if you don't involve your ministers who are doing your official foreign policy, then they don't know what you're unofficially doing, so they can't adjust your official foreign policy so that it subtly supports your unofficial foreign policy. There is something called joined up thinking. He's in a company bankruptcy, moral, financial. Moral, certainly, but, you know. Financial occasion and close, but very they never actually got there. Wrong one. Oh. Hello, Animal 16365. How's I'm86? They have a fun time, let's say. And Louis XV causes more fun than all the rest. In fact, Louis XV is probably the best argument for republicanism you can make. Come on. Louis XIV was so many things wrong with him. But even he was never derangedly stupid enough to try and run two different foreign policies for one country. Because even if you have a secret foreign policy, you should need to have it joined up with your existing foreign policy so that it works. So you don't find yourself signing a treaty with the Austrians which says one thing, while telling your agents in Poland to do a completely different thing, and your agents in Russia to do a third thing. Hello, Potter Ender Gaming. So, Le Secret de Roy. It's just... And if you're interested in this, I have to say, this is one of the things I would venture off naval history to do a video on if people would like one in the future on Louis XV's foreign policy, because it is absurd. It is truly absurd. Basically, it's often considered a start, but I think it started earlier, with the Prince de Conti's candidacy for the Polish throne, which took place during the War of the Austrian Succession, when he was at that time fighting with Austria and alongside Prussia, because he didn't like who was on the throne in Austria. It was originally set up by Cardinal Fleury, and then later on it's run by Charles Francis de Broglie and Jean-Pierre Tessier. Its agents included people like Xavier de Lyon, Pierre de Montcharis, Charles Trevoux de Morand, and Louis de Noailles. And theoretically, it ends when he dies in 1774, but it's well known that quite a lot of that organization was involved in France and its allies coming into the War of the American Independence on the American side, because they thought that if America gained its independence, Britain would fall. That was their great idea. That the 13 colonies were so critical to the British economy that if Britain lost them, Britain would die and they would rule the world. Now, this is where this all starts. The Habsburgs. Oh, we love the Habsburgs, don't we? So, this starts off with the War of the Austrian Succession, which is all pretty much over the lady in the middle, Maria Therese. Now, basically, her daddy dies, and he wants her to be queen, to be empress. So, Charles does his best to make sure she is. And he's Charles VI. The trouble is, it ends up with a war because her claim is disputed, and all sorts of issues go down on that one. Anyway, she starts after the War of the Austrian Succession. Technically, her husband Frederick is in charge, but good luck him actually getting and doing anything to actually be in charge. After he goes, technically her son takes over. Actually, no, he's Francis. Keep calling him Frederick for some reason. Francis first. Technically, Joseph II takes over, but again, good luck him actually doing anything if she doesn't tell him to. Now, Maria Theresa, she wins the War of the Austrian Succession because she stays on the throne. And this is thanks to Britain and Russia's help, which is lovely. However, she's lost Silesia to Prussia. And she will have her revenge. Vengeance will be mine, is her watchword. And this is going to drive a lot of her foreign policy. And if you are reading those dates right, yes, the War of the Austrian Succession ends in 1748. The 7 Years' War, well, technically begins in 1756, so 8 years later. But as I've already been over, possibly starts in 54, and in certain parts of India, never stopped. Never, ever stopped. Grace asking, hello. Also, Graham Hunter, also his most famous mistress was good at making decisions for him. Yes, Madame du Pompadour was far better at running France than Louis XV was. Senator, that is like rebel groups supported by the CIA attacking one supported by one of the other secret agencies of America. Yeah. Rapparosa, is trolling the French wired into the British internet code, or just expected like owning a Corgi or a Mini Cooper? It's not hardwired in, but it's definitely one of the fun hobbies. Psalm 86, your anglicized French is fine. Thank you. Not amazing, but fine. Don't be so hard on yourself. Thank you. Well, considering I haven't done French since 13? Because when I went through, they had this great idea that dyslexics shouldn't do with foreign languages. At my school, anyway. So I gave up French and German at 13. Oh. Ron Cash. So Louis XV is a serious challenger to Louis the Fat and Louis the Man for the crown of worst Louis. Yes, he is Louis the 15th. He just doesn't manage to get himself killed. That's the thing. Right, if you want to do a video on the French, go ahead. It's your channel. You can read a phone book in your voice with still trigger my wife. I'm sorry, Mrs. Razorback. Graham, he prompted the 45 Rising that was meant to happen in 44, but his ministers leaked to the British government, so it got cancelled. However, Louis decided to promise anyway. pretty much this entire war is down to her shenanigans and maneuvering. So the War of the Austrian Succession is down to Frederick the Great deciding to charge in. She outfoxes him. She has won the Battle of Which. She's got all the alliances lined up. It all looks good. And Frederick decides, frankly, I'm not going to win this in diplomatic zone. She's managed to beat me. Okay, I will attack you. And British go, well, that's fine. It's a defensive treaty. We're not doing anything. And then the French go, we'll invade Hanover anyway. And the British go, we hate you all. And Russia's going, ah, yes, Russia. Okay, so how do I put this politely? There is a good argument that Elizabeth Petrova, Empress of Russia, was brought to the throne in 1741 thanks to Louis XV's, how do I put this, machinations with his secret de Roy. Which really actually caused trouble, because if it had gone wrong, France would have lost a very powerful ally. She's then eventually succeeded by her son, Peter III, who is incompetent beyond belief. And he gets superseded by his wife, who's also sort of a relative, Catherine, who was born Sophie. We can get into all this fun. And so this is, France is playing around a lot in Russia, because this is going to sound strange. Russia is both their ally when they want to fight Prussia, but is their enemy for control of Poland. Now, their control of Poland, that battle is the secret battle by the secret de Roy faction trying to take control of Poland to put it under the Prince de Conte, who is, of course, Louis' relative. But officially, Russia is an ally for France against Prussia. There's also the Austrians mucking around here as well. Basically, how do I explain Russian politics in this period? You have a series of strong female rulers who mostly get there by finding they are married to incompetents who frankly should never be allowed anywhere near the command of a paper cut, let alone a platoon, and certainly not a country. And they find ways of getting rid of them using the assets which come from abroad. And what I always find interesting about this, and this might be me being old-fashioned, but Louis always seems to think these people are going to be loyal to him. Now, they've actually literally used you to kill off their husband. So you've been used in the very family version of a civil war. It might be nice, it might be... But also, that means if there's any fallout from it, they can blame French agents. They can. In fact, honestly, to be fair, when Catherine and Peter first try to sort of remove Elizabeth from power and accuse of it, they're doing the same thing. And they managed to get away with it largely by saying, oh, we were unknowing, people involved in this. It's the machinations of Louis and the machinations of this and this going on. Nothing to do with us. So, actually, far from being the puppeteer, you, Louis, are the patsy. Graham. That made me giggle, Jonathan Burrow. I did Spanish without dyslexia, but I still look at it. Where is it? I was trying to talk to my wife about something the other night. The fact that the leaders of Europe were all family came up. My 9-year-old wanted an explanation. We gave her one. She's got a headache. I agree. '96-81. So why did the UK economy not collapse after losing the 13 colonies in the newly independent USSR? Mostly because the British economy wasn't as dependent on colonialism as the French felt it was. Vision, Peter III looks like a hobbit in the center image. He was weird as anything. Graham Hand, Jesus, you're being polite about the male Russian purported rulers. I'm being as polite as I can be. Ron Cash, oh my god, I knew this was Gobligate, but I hadn't even scratched anything about the mystery. Well, this is my point I'm trying to make about the 7 Years' War. It's used to justify all these sorts of strategy and things, and it's good strategy, it's good doctrine which comes out. But the war itself is actually a terrible war to use for it, because most of the stuff going on is absolutely insane and has no logic to it. In fact, the only logic going on is probably the British strategic position. And that's if you divide, because Britain does the same thing in the 7 Years' War it does in the First World War. Instead of picking a strategy, it tries to do both at once. It tries to do a maritime global strategy whilst also doing a European continental strategy. And finds itself going nuts. Okay. So, of course, it's a war which starts in 1756 to 1763. So you'd be glad to know the first battle a naval battle, takes place off the coast of Canada in June 1755. Under the command of Vice Admiral Boscawen. Wrap your minds around that. So, the Battle of Belle Isle. Now, let's start off with this one, because this is one of the most interesting and silly battles you're ever going to hear about. But I want to get into this full detail. So, on the 4th of February 1755, Boscawen, this gentleman, Admiral Boscawen, is one of the greatest admirals the Royal Navy's ever had, I would argue. Is promoted to Vice Admiral. And he's given command of the squadron North American Station. It's known that a squadron of partially disarmed French ships of the line have been dispatched to Canada loaded with reinforcements. So Boscawen is ordered to intercept them. The French ambassador to London hears about this. It's quite open in the British public. And he is called the Duke de Maurepas. He informs the government of George II, after having checked with his own government, that any hostility taken by British ships would be considered an act of war. Please note, this is 1755. War doesn't begin until 1756. There is an actual battle. I would say that's therefore an act of war, but we'll leave that to one side. The thing is, thick fog interferes first, and it obstructs Boscawen's reconnaissance, and it scatters the French ships. However, on the 8th of June, he sights the Alcide, the Lees, the Dauphin Royal, all off the Cape Ray off Newfoundland. They have a nice ensuing engagement, and the British capture the Alcide and Elise. The Dauphin Royal manages to escape. Now, here's the really, really fun part of history for you all. Amongst the men made prisoner, it includes the captain of the Alcide. This gentleman is called M. de Hocquart, and it was the third time Boscawen had fought him, and the third time he had taken his ship. So, he might now be asked if he feels that Boscawen is making things personal between the two of them, because it's so far 3-0 capturing your ship. Boscawen to the Hocquart. Either that, or they have an agreement going where Hocquart gets the money for supplying ships to the Royal Navy, because it's free for free. They also captured pay amounting to the equivalent of £80,000 in the money of that day on the Bordelese. So this sets up Boscawen very nicely, thank you, because they've managed to capture most of the pay chest going to French Canada, and they've captured most of the other things. However, some of the ships and some of the men. It's good. He then returns with the squadron to Halifax, but there's fever there, so he takes them back to England, where he returns to the Channel Fleet and is made Commander-in-Chief Portsmouth during the trial of Admiral John Byng. And this is the gentleman who makes the decision that whilst the king might refuse to grant the admiral a pardon, that doesn't mean I'm going to refuse to order his execution. He becomes Senior Naval Lord in November 1756, which is the equivalent of a modern First Sea Lord. He stands down in April 1757, but stands up again as Senior Naval Lord in July 1757, and seems to have served in that role through most of 1757 until he eventually becomes a first off second in command under Admiral Edward Hawke, and later is promoted to a full admiral of the Blue Squadron. Anyway, so we've had the first naval battle of a war. The war hasn't happened yet. So let's have the treaties, which will cause the war, but they're designed to not cause war. The whole point about them is to prevent war. The whole idea was the British would have a treaty which would secure their presence in their Hanoverian possessions in Europe, by meaning they wouldn't attack, so they wouldn't feel threatened by the French, and then the French feel that they need a treaty if attacked by Great Britain or Prussia. It's fun times. So, you have the Convention of Westminster, which is a treaty of neutrality signed on the 16th of January 1756. So remember, this treaty apparently leads to war, but that's at least 6 months after the first naval battle of the war. And if we go right back to the beginning, you'll see there's a date I mentioned here, which is 1754, when a 22-year-old Lieutenant Colonel George Washington ambushes the French at the Battle of Jumel Glen. So, arguably, the war's already a couple of years old, and it's just been nicely ticking over. Nicely ticking over. And basically, the Convention of Westminster is a treaty of neutrality. And it's an agreement between Frederick the Great of Prussia and King George II of Great Britain and the Elector of Hanover that Prussia and Great Britain would seek to prevent any foreign powers' forces from passing through the Holy Roman Empire. There you go. That sounds aggressive, doesn't it? That sounds like a real reason to be scared. It's a really aggressive treaty. As long as you don't send forces through the Holy Roman Empire, you're okay. Why would you be sending forces through the Holy Roman Empire? Well, if you're France, you could be sending them through to go to Poland to secure it against Russia. That could be a problem. But you're already allies with Prussia, and they don't want Russia in Poland either, so they'd probably allow you to come over and help them. So it becomes it's a really interesting one. It's supposed to protect Britain and Hanover, but also to protect Prussia from Austria, because it's basically suggesting that if the Austrians invade the Holy Roman Empire, the Brits will send something to help them. But this means the French go, oh, they got a treaty. We need our own treaty. Who are we going to do it with? Austria. Austria? Oh, Austria. Austria. We could be the dominant party. We are, after all, I am Louis XV. I am a smart man. I will tell Maria Theresa what to do, despite the fact that she just beat me in a war in the Austrian succession and actually got the title, got the throne. But no, I'll tell her what to do. And so they end up a treaty of mutual assistance if attacked by Great Britain or Prussia. It's fun. Send here. If someone wrote a book with stuff like that in it, it would be called Completely Unrealistic. Yep. Ryan Cash. Versailles doesn't have a good track record when it comes to treaties, does it? Nope. Remember, we talk about how to get people into history, but they think it's about boring, but they love Game of Thrones and Vikings. Did one in the past, but can you do an old school brew ships or a book or two? The review on people and events who need more movies miniseries. Oh, I could do that one. Graham Hound. What treaty has ever prevented war? Maybe delayed it, but never prevented it. They say regularly, only applies if all sides stick to it. Rarely happens ever. I have an answer to that one. I do have an answer to that one. It's called NATO. But it has come very close to war. A lot. And honestly, you can say, actually, in many ways, what NATO and the Warsaw Pact did was they standardized the command structure and homogenized the command and control of the two alliances to such an extent that they made it unlikely that you'd have people going off and going rogue. And because you have multiple democracies involved on one side, but all on both sides, you have multiple bureaucracies and governments, and meaning they have to meet, they have to discuss, they have to explain their actions. Even in the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact was rarely as dictatorial as it might necessarily seem at first glance. They could be dictatorial, but it was often had to be a bit consensual led, and especially if you're planning an aggressive action. And so those sort of did stop war in terms of European war. But remember, all they did was they displaced it into a lot of proxy fighting around the world, which wasn't necessarily good for anyone, especially not outside Europe. John Shea, treaties that make war that was intended to prevent war, since that is what treaties. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Nautical Wolf. So, we now have the Siege of Fort St. Philip. Now, again, this is always a fun one. Why is this a fun one? Well, because this is also known as the Fall of Minorca. And it's, you have to remember at this point, Minorca was under British control because the British have got it in a previous war. And it's a French force under the command of Duc de Richelieu. Now, if you're wondering if he is a relative of the famous Cardinal de Richelieu, I honestly... yes, he was. He was the son of Armand Jean de Vigo de Pless, Duc de Richelieu, who was the great nephew of Cardinal Richelieu. So he was the great nephew of Cardinal Richelieu of Three Musketeers fame. Anyway, and they basically land to besiege the garrison at St. Philip's Castle. Eventually, they forced them to surrender. And the reason they succeed in forcing them to surrender is because Admiral John Byng withdraws to Gibraltar after the naval battle of Minorca, and at which point the resistance to the garrison collapses. I don't know. What's interesting is that after Minorca has fallen, another group, because this is the point about the British, and this is the point you have to think about this. Byng fails. Done. Right. Next, and they are quickly organised. Another squadron, Hawke, comes out. The trouble is he doesn't have enough troops. Why doesn't he have enough troops? Because they're over in Hanover, in what's called the Army of Observation, under the command of the Duke of Cumberland. Yes, the guy for whom the sausages are named after. He is not a brilliant general by any stretch of the imagination. But it's kind of... How do I put this politely? They are there to try and protect Hanover from the French invasion, which is supposed to come. And Britain had, of course, as mentioned earlier, had tried to hire 50,000 Russian troops to defend Hanover. But that failed, and then it became, well, how do I put this? An alliance with Prussia. And then they form an army of observation made up of Hanoverian, Brunswickian, and Hessian troops, paid for by the British government. It's put under the command of the Duke of Cumberland, whose entire qualifications for the roles is that he is the second son of George II. And I know I am someone who actually is a monarchist and does support the monarchy. But there are times when that's very good. There are times where, frankly, it's not so good. He actually proves a fairly decent general at Cologne. But he's then after remembered as a bit of a butcher. And the trouble is, He does attempts at army reform. He does attempts at all sorts of things. He is just not great. But that's what we've got. We deploy the troops are there. The troops, whatever British troops and whatever available forces are either committed in North America or are committed in Hanover. They're trying to support the Hanover and the army observation. So there aren't troops available to send with Hawk. Again, you're starting to see a pattern here. You can't do both strategies. You can't do a continental and a maritime strategy. Because a maritime strategy can only be done if you have your well-trained, efficient army ready to quickly embark on sea and go where you need it to when you need it to. And a continental strategy can't adapt quickly to events. So, if you have your army off doing a continental strategy, you can't do a maritime strategy. If you have your navy and army off doing a maritime strategy, then you are probably not going to be able to send to group together the huge army you would need for a continental strategy, because you have to remember the size of armies you're dealing with. Okay, Britain was looking at hiring 50,000 Russian soldiers to go along with what they planned already to raise from the Hanoverian, the Brunswickian, and the Hessian troops. So they're probably looking at forming an army of 100,000 troops. That's what they were probably looking and aiming for, which would have been a tremendous army. But again, remember, this is the British government going to be paying for troops to defend Hanover, which is the King's territory, but doesn't pay taxes or anything towards the British government. You're starting to see why there's a large group of people in Britain who are not keen on this idea. I would argue that also one of the problems you get with the strategy and the arguments going on here in the Britain this time between the continentalists and the maritimists is that really there is a large group of people in the British body politic and certainly in the British mercantile classes who don't like the idea of paying money to have to defend territories just for the king's personal status. Mm. U.S. independence was a UK-France proxy war, wasn't it? Yep. Right. I have a bottle of Fanta here for a friend when they come, if they come and help me with some building, because they sometimes prefer Fanta. And because I'm basically hoping to have some help with a painting on the outside at some point. And I keep picking up instead of the iron brew. It's terrible. Keep getting a, oh, that's the wrong colour of orange. I might end up drinking myself, though, just not tonight. Duckling95, what's your opinion on how effective proxy forces are, and are we doing our own version with the formation of Ranger Regiment? Well, how do I put this politely? Currently, what you're seeing with the British forces is we're turning our ground forces, especially, into more and more elite specialized units, which are great. They are amazingly capable formations. And I don't think Britain needs or can really provide a space for maintaining a large when I say large, I'm talking army the size it was maintaining for most of the Cold War in Britain. I would like to see a decently constituted armor division, but if I had my way, that armor division would probably be made up of 2 regular and 2 reserve brigades, with the ability that it could mobilize, it could put together definitely a solid force of 3 brigades, a 3 brigade armor division in the event of war. I would also like to see sort of basically an infantry formation, a sort of a mechanized infantry formation or strike formation, as they're calling it, for global deployments to support the Royal Marines. I think the trouble is with British strategy at the moment is it's deciding what it's going to do. Because we have a sort of scenario reaching us which is kind of like we had in the 7 Years' War, kind of like at the beginning of the First World War, and to an extent in the Second World War, and we have coming on us now. In that, if you look at the money, it's being invested in the services other than the army. If we look at the Second World War, we're investing in the Navy, we're investing in the Air Force. The Army was getting investment. Again, it was the only fully mechanized, motorized army in the world. But let's be honest, we sometimes talk about the RAF getting a lot of money. They were building chain home and things like that, which were pretty expensive infrastructure to buy land and set up. The Royal Navy had its infrastructure. This is the thing. So this is one of the reasons why you have the difference in spending. People sometimes forget that, but for the RAF, they actually had to build their infrastructure leading up to World War II. Quite a lot of it. The Navy already has its infrastructure, so a far higher percentage of what the Navy gets can go on actually training personnel and building ships. I still would like to see slightly more money having gone the Navy's way, but we'll leave that to one side. That does explain some of the funding. But the Army was definitely number 3. We look at that today, currently, at the moment today, that also looks like where we're heading. But no one will want to admit that. No one will want to admit that they're doing that because that makes life upsetting for the army. And the army are always quite, how do I put this, well connected in terms of politics. So you're always left to think that the British have a strategy, and it tends to be a maritime-led strategy. But they can never ignore the continental strategy, the army stuff. They always have to at least give it lip service. And this is what leads us into trouble, because then you have things like 5 divisions of troops being deployed to the Western Front at the beginning of World War One, and you're sort of going, you're 100,000 troops. There are 2 3-million-man armies about to clash. Good luck. Yes, you're supremely well trained. Yes, you are probably one of the best armies out there, but that's not what you're built for. If you're concentrating on 100,000 man rapid reaction army, you are talking about a maritime intervention force. You're talking about a force which you should be doing amphibious operations. It should have been deployed into Antwerp rapidly in front of the German advance, so that when they arrived at Antwerp, they suddenly found it ring fenced by 5 divisions, going, "You want to come for us?" and get held up there, and possibly put off the strike to Paris that way. There's various options are discussed through. And there's various options which are looked at during the 7 Years' War. This is one of the interesting things that this comes up in this one. There are lots of amphibious operations in the 7 Years' War. The Battle of Shananga in India is another example of one. You have you have warships turn up and provide fire support, but as you can see from the map of action, you also have land-based artillery being heavily involved. And unsurprisingly, the fort falls. I would argue it's not necessarily the best made fort, or best designed fort, but it's taken. And so if we get back to the Rangers, I see it almost as a rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. There were units which were already doing the Ranger role. They just weren't badged as the Rangers. They had different badges. I think it was even one of the companies of the Rifles was doing it. And okay, fine, we'll call them the Rangers. Cute. That's good. That's good. That they'll be happy, I'm sure. But you sit there and go, what's it actually providing Britain with that we didn't already have? What's all the cost and all the stuff that's been put into doing this PR stuff, given the army, that it didn't already have actually going on? And I have great respect for the British Army. I think they are very well trained. They are very, very hardworking, and they're very good at what they do. But there aren't a lot of them, and I see them getting more and more spread as penny packets over things. And I see the same thing in the Royal Navy. You will never get me arguing that we don't need more ships. We do need more ships. We do need more crew. And if I was given my first choice tomorrow of where, if I was asked, right then, you're allowed to raise the British Armed Forces by 20,000 personnel overall, I would probably be putting at least 8,000 of those into the Navy. Probably 10. I'd probably be putting 6 into the Army and 4 into the Air Force. And the reason the Air Force is getting less is because they are arguably quite homogenous at the moment, and they're quite organised. And they do need to grow, and they do need more personnel, but they don't need to grow as dramatically. They need to grow not in terms of numbers of units, but in terms of the number of aircraft. You want the Wedgetail up to at least 7 or 8 units. You want the P8 up to extra number of units and all those things. But that requires personnel, but less personnel than growing the frigate force to 12 Type 26s and probably 9 Type 31s and 9 Type 32s. And growing the AD3s up to 12 as well. Mm-hmm. Graham Hanlon. Name Butcher comes from him being offered the membership of the World Worship Company of Butchers. Hmm. Professor, isn't the Empire territory for the King status? Yes and no. Yes and no. And by the way, these are the Luminaries who are involved in the Rochefort raid. And the fact that it doesn't actually achieve anything is mostly thanks to the general at the top here, who gets a very nice cartoon written about him. And yes, there is a Colonel de Wolf involved, and there are a few admirals, and there's Cornwallis, and there's all sorts of really, really good officers involved, and they achieve nothing. Again, amphibious operations don't always go to plan. In this case, they land, and they don't do anything. They withdraw. Because sometimes you don't have the right commanders. You could sit there and go, well, if Cornwallis or Wolfe had been in charge, Rochefort could have been a very different operation. But they weren't. Rabbit isn't the Empire territory for the King status? No, because most of the Empire is actually about trading territory. So yeah, if you consider the East India Company territory, that's Empire, but that's not the King status. And then you have the various colonies, which are sort of the king status, but remember they're British, so whilst the king is the head of Britain, theoretically they are the head of state. This is already well into the time at which we would start to call the constitutional monarchy developing. So it's the beginning of the time at which the monarch is getting less and less power. They still have a lot of power, but they don't have undisputed power by any stretch of the imagination. Legacy of the Civil War, but also legacy of Queen Anne, William and Mary, Charles II, James II's brief interlude. All these things have meant that the Georges find themselves with less and less influence over things. It's more and more, how do I put it? There's a question which we usually teach UK students when they're doing US politics, which is US president. How much do you agree to statement? Foreign policy dictator, domestic policy counselor. Because they always have to counsel when it comes to domestic policy. They've got to try and cajole and get people back. But in foreign policy, they have almost sweeping powers. And it's a how much do you agree with a statement question. So it's really quite a good one, as it's an open-ended one, and it tends to be a 45-mark essay question, I think, in one of the PATE exam boards, and a 30-marker in another one. And it's a good question to have. But in this period, you very much have the king is theoretically in charge, but if George II had tried to do what Louis XV was doing, he would have found himself very quickly losing influence, power, and possibly finding he loses his life in an oh so interesting accident with a molehill. That's it here. Americans don't seem to like their war for independence being called a proxy war. No, but there again, it is a proxy war, but it isn't a proxy war. It doesn't start out as a proxy war, but it becomes a proxy war. Because of the way the other actors around the world respond to it. Hieroglyphic gets it right. They don't contribute or instigate it, contribute till after the colonists' victory at Ticonderoga. Yes, but after that, their navy turns up and the French navy is critical to it, and also there's the fact that the British are fighting the French elsewhere in the world, which is why it turns into a proxy war. It doesn't start out there, but it turns into one in a sense. And there's a lot of money and various other things. And as I said, the secret de Roy are involved in the French War and the American War of Independence from the beginning as well. We can hope that night 6A31. They've allocated 6 more registrations to the PATA, which seems to indicate number 6 will be bought. We can hope. Take care, John Shea. But you also have to remember, Senator, what with the molehill? That was what happened to William. A mole hill. His horse stumbled. The point about Rochefort is it's a raid which is very badly executed in some respects. The Navy does quite well. The Army, the troops and the colonels are good, but there's a problem with the leadership, and they do realise that quite quickly, and they start changing leadership. But they're not the only ones having problems in navies, and this is an interesting lesson actually for Prussia. Because believe it or not, that territory at that point isn't Germany. No. That is Sweden. That is Sweden. And the Prussia wants to blockade it. But Britain has managed to so far avoid Russia and Sweden being at war with it. So it's still got its naval supplies coming from the Baltic quite happily. Remember, that's the way the treaties go in this one. And so the Royal Navy goes, sorry, we need it elsewhere. We can't spare you any ships. And so he's trying to blockade a port without any ships. Anyone else would call it a siege. The Planova, Swedish Pomeranian, isn't it? Yes, it was. And it's a lesson, which is if you don't have your own maritime power, you can't have a maritime strategy. If you can't have a maritime strategy, you can't have a complete strategy. And this is what Mahan draws from it, what many others have drawn from it. It's one of the things about being a strategist is that some of it does really sound like stating the blindingly obvious. The blindingly obvious being that if you don't have a navy, you can't do things at sea. Next requirement is that navy be of a viable, sustainable strength. And that's more of a problem. I would also argue that another name for a strategist and a theorist that I have seen talked about, and actually some of them describe themselves, is historian for the present. And this goes back to what Rapid Razorback was saying about earlier about practitioners. If you're thinking about coming up with something new and something really sort of novel, etc., maybe a practitioner is the way to go. And certainly, I have no problem with practitioners who become theorists. I don't mind where they come from. But if you go with the historian of the present, i.e., someone who is reminding people of what the relevant lessons of history are for the present, so that we don't forget them when we're making the decisions now, as a strategist. And I would argue Julian Corbett and, to an extent, Mahan, and definitely Richmond and Cable, and Sims, are far more that way inclined. They're historians of the present, in that they are looking at the present scenario and they're telling people, look, this is the history to go and look at. This is the history you can draw some guidance from. This is the history you need to start thinking about when you want to make these decisions, because you don't want to do this mistake. You want to do it this way because this was the way it worked. I think that works quite well. And I think the trouble is, because of the way we start to think about things today, we can get very bogged down. And again, I turn to that US Rear Admiral who said a couple of months ago, I'm not a strategist, I'm a practitioner. Well, that worries me when someone who's a Rear Admiral says that, because you'd think if anyone in their service is going to be taking time to stand back and start thinking it'd be a Rear Admiral and start thinking about it. But it also emphasizes to me the importance of possibly the civilian historian based, usually historian of the present strategists, the ones who are going, well, look, you are a practitioner, fine, but read this, okay? Take 5 minutes this weekend, read this book, get an idea in your head, please. Please. For me. Just for me. And I'll stop bugging you. So there is also the fact that I think coming up with a national strategy is a conversation. I think countries can have strategies which and can have a strategic approach which can fit them for 6 months, for 6 years, for 60 years. But I think it's always an ongoing conversation about what is the right balance to strike. I don't think there is a hard and there is such a thing as a hard and fast strategy that you apply absolutely 100% of the time. I just don't. And that might be because of my background, because I'm a historian, and I suppose when I get involved in strategy, the usual areas are things around conventional deterrence and how to try and manage and prevent, limit conflicts. And there isn't a hard and fast point. And that's something which you see in the 7 Years' War a lot, is that there is a point where you are putting in enough force which is a deterrent, because for the enemy to do any operations, they have to bring sufficient force to beat that. But it's not so much force that they have to bring stuff to beat it, because it's a threat. Because that's the real risk. And that's the trouble if we go back again to those treaties. The real risk for the French was that any form of rapprochement between Prussia and Britain becomes a threat to Poland in terms of their eyes, because Britain is traditionally usually allied, allied with the Russians, etc. At this point, and they've been mucking around there. And if they want to try and get control of Poland, they need that. But also, the British, with the Prussian backing, that secures Hanover. And suddenly, the thing which the French have been relying on to try and control the British, because they realised that whilst the British government didn't give a flying hoot about Hanover, they really don't, despite Newcastle being a continental and they don't. Hanover is not their problem. It doesn't elect them, and it doesn't pay them taxes. Their whole thing is the King of Britain, George II, is obsessed with Hanover. So it's a way of blackmailing him to try and control the British government. And it especially works that way if you are King Louis and you think that the king must be in charge 100% and all the rest must be window dressing. But it doesn't work. So once they ally that, they've taken away that, they've done too good a job of deterrence in a way, because allied with Russia, well, those troops would have to get through Prussia to get to Hanover. France would feel, well, the Prussians will hold them up, so we don't have to worry about that, but we do have to think about it. So it would be a case of that would be enough of a deterrence. But once they have to go with Prussians, they are that step closer. It means that there's no chance of you using your force in theory. In practice, it doesn't work that way, because they do an agreement with Austria, and then Austrians have an agreement with Russia, and then Prussians decide, right, Frederick decides, right, now I'm just going to attack you to try and fix this. But the whole thing is based around the idea of deterrent, but it's almost too strong a deterrent. And that is a concept that's interesting to get around people and try and explain. I do tend to use the 7 Years' War as an example of this. It's a too strong deterrent. It's so good on paper, and it really is. It's a blinding idea on paper, but it immediately means the French are forced into doing a knee-jerk reaction, which gives the Austrians a blank check, which means they start massing their forces versus the Prussians, and the Prussians are forced to go on the offensive, and that leads to everyone else ending up in a war before everyone else is really ready. Other than actually, curious enough, Britain, for once, the 7 Years' War is one of the few wars where Britain's actually fairly mobilised for it. Possibly because it's already been fighting the war for 2 years. And in October 1757, Austrian Hussar General Andreas had it raided Berlin. True. Thank you, Carl. But I'm trying to concentrate on the naval ones. But I don't know. A theorist who became a practitioner? I good at it? To an extent. Count Gaswood, speaking of money, General Haddock left Berlin with a ransom of 15,000 thalers and a dozen gloves for the Empress. Well, you've got to take some gloves back for the Empress. I would agree with that with Sean Mack on Gudrun overestimating his role in developing doctrine. Doxon, how do you arrange for a horse to step on a molehill? Well, that's the thing. First, the horse has to trip up. Then you have to make the earth look like there's a molehill. Appraising. Were I a practitioner, I might have issues taking someone who wasn't seriously. I know, Rapid Raceback. I have dealt with that one on quite a lot of experience and time. But again, I think it tends to the expense is the point is, are you good at what you do? Because a good practitioner will tend to listen to a good strategist no matter where they come from, because they'll make sense. And that's the thing. In my view, practitioners tend to be quite careful about which people they listen to. But if you're good at what you do and you make sense, then they like you. But also, you have to remember the other role of a strategist, especially one of the latter group, as I said, the historians of the present, is that they tend to be the ones who try and explain the practitioners to the politicians, and that's the thing. So the practitioner might well go, well, I need to work with you because I need you to explain me to the politicians and explain the politicians to me. In which case, the price of working with me is you have to listen to me when I'm talking to you. And if you don't, then I'll stop working with you. Doesn't mean you have to do what I say, but you have to listen. And if you listen to what I'm saying as a practitioner, as a historian in the present, and I'm doing this in saying that in person, not as me personally, then eventually you're going to start thinking about what I'm saying. Hopefully. There's also the Battle of Cuddalore, which is a pretty cool battle. Again, part of the Franco-European force in India. And there's a nice drawing. Basically, where I haven't got a decent painting of the bill of a battle, but I found plans of the ships involved, I have put a plan of the ship involved. They're rather cool. I might do some more t-shirts soon with plans on, once I can get them to work properly on the joyous thing that is Spreadshirt. My praise, I think the US, UK, and Australians need to start looking at a recommended reading for how to fight a war in the Pacific. That's what quite a lot of reading lists being produced by people who've been around for years, for the last 5 years have been around. Although I do find some of the British Army ones interesting on that one. Because you'd think from it they're going to be deploying a major force to the Pacific, and you sit there and go, there isn't a major force. But that, again, that could sound to me like I'm bashing the army. I'm not. I am bashing sometimes their strategic communications, because, well, I'm not sure that I'm not sure where the MBTs are coming for them for coming from to provide tanks on 5 major deployments. Either their definition of major is only 30 tanks, or I don't know. What if we have 100 and something tanks? I think it might slip lower. I keep hearing. But the point is, you might have noticed, is that quite a lot of the naval operations around the world are amphibious ones coming up. And that is the thing. A global maritime strategy is one of global maneuver. You turn up with troops, you rapidly move them. The campaigns in India, they're often going, oh, yes, these troops are coming down the coast. And they're marching his army. And they go, well, why is the army at the coast? Oh, well, that's where the roads are. It's also nice and near the ships, where the ships can provide them with fire support, but also, often more importantly, the ships can bring their food and supplies on them. It's the same lesson as you learn in the US Civil War, i.e., it's logistics. And again, this is the interesting thing about Clive of India and the army set up in the East Indian Company's army out there. They understand logistics. They're very bureaucratic about it, but they understand logistics, and they make sure their armies have logistical support. Their armies don't move without logistics. You also have the reality, and this is something which, again, we talk about the 7 Years' War, and it's the reason why the theorists are picking up on it is it's a war which is far enough back because we're talking the 1750s, and they're picking this up in the 1890s, 1900s. So it's roughly 150 years back, so a century and a half. So there aren't that many people around who are going to argue the toss with them on it. And that's again a good thing for someone who is a historian of the present or theorist, strategist, to put forward. Because the point is, no one's fought a big peer on peer war at this point. For a good 50 odd years? Yes, there was the Crimea. But that wasn't really a peer conflict, as far as the British were concerned. It was an intervention, but not really much of a conflict. Fight the Opium Wars? Nah. Boer War? Well, that led to the Haldane reforms and a few other issues for the army. But one interesting thing about the Haldane reforms is they're implemented by Haldane after reading Julian Courbet's The 7 Years' War. So he goes and reads The 7 Years' War, which illustrates all the changes that are made in the British Army and the Royal Navy during the 7 Years' War to professionalise them, goes, that's really good ideas. Looks at the current existing British Army at the time going, how the frick have we regressed back to before this? How? All the generals sitting going, well, you know, and a couple of smarter generals going, well, sir, I can't think why. I cannot think why at all. I.e., mostly engineering officers sitting there going, can any of you do maths? Do you understand logistics? Have you heard the phrase, and I mean this seriously, have you heard the phrase maneuver? Nope. Okay. Minister Haldane, I have a suggestion. Or rather, Secretary of State Haldane, I have a suggestion. Which probably is what leads to the artillery and engineering officers basically taking over the British Army for about 30 odd years. And then someone usually goes, well, you know, they're hiring the Irish and the Scots to do it. And you sit there and go, well, they're not really hiring the Irish and the Scots. The Irish and the Scots education has both been orientated around providing smart people a way up. The English mass education is mostly dumped down by the fact that quite a lot of the positions in the regular line regiments are taken by army officers, by connected people who've got political or economic connections that can get them, especially for the buying and the commissions period, and that causes problems for the army because it means that when they look at a comparison to the Navy, which whilst it does have similar issues, does at least have two factors going for it. One, you still face examinations to get up into certain ranks in the Navy, which you have to pass or you aren't getting up. And two, the good thing about the Navy is that basically wartime is a time when they are allowed to actually have an enemy they can fight back against. In peacetime, their main enemy is the sea. And again, this is a beautiful design of a ship. It's an absolutely beautifully designed ship as well. Look at that hull. Look at the piercings. That is a very well designed ship. And so the point is, the Haldane reforms are mostly based on the 7 Years' War reforms. What does the 7-Year War reform do? Well, that's one of the reasons why Wolfe gets the position he does, and why you get a sudden surge in army officers, in that they basically look for the colonels who understand artillery and understand logistics. What is Wolfe's position on the Rochefort expedition? He's the quartermaster. He's in charge of making sure the supplies, as well as running his own, sorting out his own troops, etc. He's in charge of making sure the entire operation supplies work. And he does it. He does it. He does it well. And this is the reason. He is well equipped. It's kind of, if you want to go using another example, yes, he's a colonel when it happens to him, but another officer whose example of that is, of course, Grant. The reason Grant understands logistics arguably as well as he does, and does what he does in the American Civil War, is because he spent so many years as a freaking quartermaster and learned the skill, learned the logistics, did operations, did fighting, but also had to deal with logistics, had to deal with the reality that his army is only as good as the food and the ammunition it can bring with it. And if it doesn't have food, if it doesn't have ammunition, it ain't fighting. So there is no point in moving if you cannot move that with you. So if you can get rivers where you can move these things faster than you can by road, because you can move them in larger quantities and at higher speed, because the roads are that bad a condition and you don't have cars or anything like that. You just have horse-drawn carriages and carts. That will make your forces move quicker. If you can have railways do it, that's just as good. In fact, in many ways better, because railways tend to go in a nice straight line, or rather a broadly straight line, whereas rivers tend to wiggle all over the place. But this is the reality. The 7 Years' War is a learning war. It's a teaching war. And it's a teaching war that the British learn a lot in. They start off, honestly, not that great. Let's be honest. Byng loses Majorca and gets executed for it. No qualms. If we go back to Rochefort, that general, let me just make sure I get his name correct. John Morden is very nearly executed, very, very nearly. He's court-martialed for it. And his defense centers on the technicality that his instructions for the expedition did not include an absolute requirement to make a landing. However, because of their actions, George II removes Morden, Conway, and Cornwallis from the army staff in July 1758 because of this, because of the failure of this. And Rochefort never again gets a senior command again. He retains his commission, but because the king has great displeasure, and whilst the king doesn't have maybe supreme power, he does certainly have enough power that if he's displeased with you, by gum, your life is not going to be great. He never gets anything. He's made governor of Berwick-upon-Tweed from 1778 to 1780, but dies in his home in Southampton in 1780. Morden never married, never had children, left nothing, disappears from history. And it's all because he doesn't do anything. When he gets to the battle, he looks at them, he decides it's too risky and goes home. And the force that they'd taken to Rochefort had been 31 warships and 49 transports, with 10 battalions of soldiers. 10 battalions. Wolfe, not only doing his role as quartermaster and all those things, actually is the officer who volunteers to lead the reconnaissance ashore, goes ashore, concludes the French garrison is too weak to prevent the landing, urges Mordaunt to action, offering to capture the town himself if given just 500 men, or pretty much a battalion. They spend 2 days debating whether or not to do anything while sitting off the coast. And then they go in. They have a second meeting, and basically Admiral Hawke says to the Mordaunt, "You will either attack or we will return to England. I'm not sitting here forever waiting for you to make your mind up. I just don't have the time or patience." And that's why they sail home eventually on the 29th of September. But one of the things, the interesting thing is, they basically sit off the coast of Rochefort from the 21st of September, when they capture the Ile d'Ye, to the 29th. So for an entire over a week, they sit off the French coast going, shall we or shan't we? With Wolfe, Cornwallis, and Hawke, and a unassuming officer, a very unassuming officer, called Howe, as in future Richard Howe, first Earl Howe and Admiral of the Fleet, all sitting there looking at Mordaunt going, why aren't we attacking? So this is the other problem with doing with any form of strategy. You not only need to have the strategy and need to actually implement it and have the material, the personnel, all the things you need for it, but you also need to have the personnel in terms of the characters who actually implement it. Sean Cash, same tactic as Richard Lionheart to march down to Jerusalem. Yep. Use the sea to move your supplies. I agree with tanks on Pacific Islands. They are useful, but again, let's say the army, the British Army, if we go back to that sort of the Pacific scenario, do want tanks on to be able to land on Pacific Islands for some reason. They want to be able to take part in that. Well, then they'd better hope that whatever replaces Albion, Bulwark, and the Bay classes has a dock facility and can take landing craft. Because otherwise, you ain't getting tanks ashore. There aren't ships around which can randomly go up to beaches, the merchant ships that can be taken on trade, randomly go up to beaches, possibly under fire, and drop off vehicles. There aren't. And if you don't have a constructed ship to do the role, you won't have anything to do the role. So in that case, the army should be making a case for that to the Navy, because the Navy's got to make a case for the budget to the Treasury. And with the army spending most of its life at the moment, it seems, in the UK, trying to take pot shots at the carrier program, which is what would provide air cover to support those amphibious groups to actually get them out there and actually support them and get them there, it suggests to me that there isn't much strategy going on. Because I actually, again, I support armor. I support having these things. I don't think doing an infantry-based attack is actually sensible these days. I know that'll get me into trouble, and I do hang out with Royal Marines enough often to hear their mantras and hear them saying what they do. And I know they are committed, and I know they are well trained, and I know how good they are and how brave they are. But as much as I love and respect them, I would feel far happier if they had a detachment of BAE BAE's U.S. Marine Corps armored personnel carrier system units, vehicles with them that could do the amphibious assault, but also provide them some fire support and organic mobility. I'd feel far happier in that scenario. And I know how good the Vikings are. I love the BBs. They're very cool vehicles, but... What is the RM plan if Kirov and its sisters set sail again? Well, the Peter Velikli does set sail occasionally, and I'm fairly sure whenever she does in British territory, she's covered on the surface by an OPV to just be slightly rude, and probably underwater there's probably an astute sitting not far away, ready to go. Oh, you need some holes. You need some holes underneath you. Oh, that's fine. We'll let some water in. Supply people scare me. How did you get that? Do you really want to know, or do we get it? No. Don't worry, I know, guy. Yeah, supply people are good. Ambition. Actually, a lot of our railways in USA follow rivers because it's cheaper than cutting and tunnelling, so maybe not that straight. Oh, MC Legend 13. H. Vision. Also, remodern Haldane in modern parlance. Should there be a glass ceiling above modern infantry regiments in the British Army? I'd hope not. Alright, do you have video operator plans for the 7th or the 10th of December? There are some video plans coming out. I think the 10th is supposed to be the 7th. Yes, I've got something, and I think the 9th. I'm not sure if I've got anything planned for the 10th. Not a wolf, so they were sacked for not overriding him. Pretty much, I would say in Rochefort case, I would say Cornwallis is sacked because he doesn't. He is so connected into the nobility and the ruling half of the country that he is expected to have done something. And in many ways, he goes off and tries to salvage his reputation elsewhere. The other two are just sacked. Wolf isn't sacked. Wolf is promoted because of it. MC Legend 38. What if the RN had built 4 Admiral class battlecruisers, Hood, Anson, Howe? What would the 4th name be? And would those names mean the last two KGBs would be called Beatty and Jellicoe? The 4th was going to be Rodney. So the first impact that would have is if you built the Nelson and Rodney class. Because there would have to be another one after Nelson, so that could be Bosquin or it could be Collingwood. If they still build them. If they don't build them, then expect them to be Nelson and Collingwood. I'm not sure how the stream's bitrate keeps dropping. I'm talking, it's talking, and it's all working fine. And my sister's no longer teaching next door. 9681, you should do something for Pearl Harbor's 80th anniversary. I think I am doing something on the 7th. Yes, I am. I've got something on the 7th. I've got a video on the Let me just check. I'll announce that all at the end. I've got that all in the end. I'll talk about that. Speaking of stuff at the end, there is a link down below, and I'll just say this now quickly, to Tassafaronga and the Battle of that name and the video that I've done for that. And the reason I've got that link down below is so that you can go and vote, because I am doing, under the comments section for there, I'm doing a vote scenario. And if you watch to the end of the video, you will find out what the vote is about. But basically the vote is, these are some options for an extra live between Christmas and New Year, which I'm doing by YouTube viewer vote, and literally it's based on the comments. So if you go look at it, like it, and vote, then I will go. Then I will do it. If that sort of sense, if that makes sense. Right, the Battle of Negabatan, or Negabatim, is a battle which took place in 1758. It's another one off the coast of India, and it's under Vice Admiral George Pocock and against the Comte d'Act. It's not really a great battle for anyone. This is one of those things. You're often used to, when I talk about the histories of the Royal Navy, you're almost expecting me always, especially when we're fighting the French, to go, and the Royal Navy won. Well, in this case, it's an indecisive battle. It really is an indecisive battle. They blast away at each other for a few hours, and nothing much happens. It really doesn't. In fact, that's the legacy of the battles in the Indian Ocean. The Navy and the British Navy and the French Navy blast away at each other for a few hours, and nothing much happens. I would argue for two reasons. Both sides are not prepared to risk a lot unless they are sure of victory, because they are so far away from logistical support and something viable which can look after them. And both sides realize that whatever ships they have are what the ships they have. So they stick to doctrine very strictly. They don't risk things. And I would argue Pocock actually does a pretty darn good job. He doesn't win battles, they're all indecisive. But he doesn't lose. And he managed to secure enough of the sea and sea control by his maneuvering, by his operations, that the East India Company gets to use its troops ashore to do the job it wants to do, which is take the French East India Company out and the Dutch East India Company out. Vision, India and China are investing a lot to bring rail freight up to standard equal or even better than North America. Yep. To be fair, India needs a modern. India's railway the dependence is quite obvious because they're trying to go for an environmentally friendly way to try and reform their transit system. And it's interesting to note that most of the modern Western democracies and most of the other countries now, which are talking really a lot about the green agenda, this might be a show an idea of why we should always be worried about people saying something is the scientifically obvious choice. Are looking at their 1950s era road freight will rule the day. We don't need to worry about railways routines and going, ouch, because we all know the way to make it easier would be to use more rail traffic because that's the easiest way to green it up. I know you review books for publishers. What about journals? I'm happy to review whatever's sent to me. And I have I am doing some reviewing. I've got to send off the back report. I do the review. For journals, I tend to review articles, and yeah, I'm a fun reviewer to have. I think I try and be positive and try and find something interesting to be helpful with. I try and look at it properly. Let's take care of it. The UK has 4 Admiral-class battlecruisers and 2 Renown-class battlecruisers. How does that affect the Washington Naval Treaty? Everyone else has a panic attack. I think they might insist that the British turn some of their battlecruisers into aircraft carriers, but it may or may not happen. Kevin Rain, hello. Relatively speaking, how would you compare the increasing world position? 7 Years' War versus Napoleonic Wars. Well, that's the thing I was actually to an extent getting to in the end. Britain and France are prime powers in the 7 Years' War. But how do I put this politely? The 7 Years' War is when Prussia suddenly becomes a middle-ranking power that you don't want to mess with unless you have to. Russia tries to go for major power status. Austria probably gets closer to major power, but is in firm middle power status. France and Britain are confirmed as major powers. And to an extent, Spain gets humbled by Portugal. You always have to remember that's one of the interesting things in this war is that the British provide Portugal with minimal support, and Portugal beats up Spain. And the Spanish sort of going. But both those powers and the Dutch are going down. The Dutch stay neutral throughout it, and that causes them a lot of problems because their traditional ally is Britain. And they stay neutral. And so Britain goes, right, then you're no longer our traditional ally. Because if you're not going to join us in fighting the French, and you're not going to join us in protecting Hanover, and if you're not going to join us in doing these things because you strategically feel you can't, then we strategically feel we can't rely on you, so we strategically don't think you're our ally anymore. To which the Dutch go, bah, 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 and then the Dutch... There's one of those things, the Dutch don't get involved, but the Dutch East India Company do get involved, and they get beaten up by the East India Company. It's not fun. Alfie, are there any age of sail equivalents to the Washington-London naval treaties? No one was that stupid. Let's put it this way. The Washington-London naval treaties are a product of their time. And arguably, they're all about trying to stop the only 2 powers who actually had the money and inclination to actually do a building race doing it. But, in a way, they're also about them not having to pay for that. I would argue the Americans are the big winners of the Washington Naval Treaty because they were never going to fund these things, and they get the British agree to cancel stuff. The British cancel stuff that they were prepared to fund. the Americans weren't going to fund it. The American Congress, to try and get money out of the fund Navy for the American Congress is fundamentally impossible. They only build a number of four stackers they do because they contractually have to, because of the contracts they signed. And because they realize trying to get out of those contracts will be more expensive than actually just maintaining them. So, yeah. The Washington Treaty was sensible, except from British government perspective, when they wanted to reduce spending so they could pay down the debt quicker, because they made the choice to pay down the debt quicker. Again, British government spending is slightly different, and government handling of debt is different from what your household debt would be. So you always have to remember it's a choice. The governments choose how quickly they're going to pay down a debt. They have to service the interest, but they can choose to pay it down quicker or pay it down slower. Sometimes governments choose to pay it down more slowly because they bank on, if they're paying the interest, on inflation reducing it. Which sounds really quite wrong, but it's quite simple. If you've got inflation running at about 3 or 4%, you've got interest of 0.5%. Over 10, 15 years, the value of that debt proportional to your economy goes down and down and down, and the value of that debt as a chunk compared to your total spend probably goes down and down and down. So then you can just pay it off quickly in one go. Especially if it's a system where you don't have to pay it off for 50, 60 years. So if you can leave it for 60 years and you're just servicing the interest, by the time you've got 60 years' time, the amount of money if you're supposed to pay it, or you will pay it back then, it's probably, thanks to inflation, nowhere near what it was when they originally did it. Which, by the way, you can't do with your mortgage, really. There are people who claim you can do it with your mortgage, but honestly, if you look at most terms of most mortgages agreed today, you can't do it. So, sorry. That's what I learnt from Martin Lewis' show, anyway. The Battle of St. Cast. This is a fun battle. One of the ones I'm sure you'll never have heard of that often, but, you know, it's a good battle. That's everyone. So, do you leave which comment of the topic you chose in the comment for this vote? Basically, you put the comment, you put it in the comment under the Tassafaronga video. That's what I'll be going for. Okay, all the vote comments are the votes I'm doing in one place. I'm going to be checking the Tassafaronga videos comment section. So if you comment on other videos, I'm sorry, but they don't count. And I'm doing that literally to see if this works. It's a tester. If it works and people engage and they like it and they want to do it more and it seems to be popular, I will do it again. But it's one of those things. It's me testing it out. As they say, I've answered that one. Carl goes, which weight league in Sweden? Which league is Sweden in that era? Well, they end up fighting against the Prussians, so they end up on the side of the Russians against the fighting against the Prussians on the side of the Russians. But basically, there ends up being an agreement with Frederick, which is basically we'll go back to what we had at the beginning of the war, and we're all happy. MC Legend video. If the RN actually had all 4 admirals, would 2 be in the Mediterranean fleet to counter the Lahorias and the other 2 in the Atlantic home fleet to counter Bismarcks? Nope. Maybe in World War II, but doubtful. The admirals are battle cruisers. They are oceanic ships. There is a reason why whenever they send a battle cruiser into the Mediterranean, it's usually one of the smaller, usually Renown, or which is the the modernized one. If they had been if they'd been modernized, maybe one of them would be in the Mediterranean, but they're not sending unmodernized one into the Mediterranean. They'll use them in the Atlantic for hunting down Panzerschiff. They'll use them in the Atlantic for hunting down ships where they can have room to maneuver. They might well deploy them out to the Indian Ocean as part of the force out there, because they would be a very useful cover force for the Indian Ocean and for Singapore. So I'd expect to see them, if they have 4, expect them to be part of Force C. Also expect them to be modernized earlier on, or at least 1 or 2 of them to be modernized earlier on. Because again, if you have 6, and that's 6 battle cruisers, that's a major component of your force. Because you're allowed 18 capital ships. So if you have the 6 of those, the 5 Queen Elizabeths, the 5 R's, maybe Nelson and Nelson and Rodney equivalent. Well, Nelson class. That's your 18 ships. Not awful, yeah. It blew my friend's mind when I explained about government spending. Once you get your head around it, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I wanted to ask whether Sweden was a major or medium power. Sweden this time, I would say they're a major power in Europe, but they're a medium power in terms of the world, because they are not a big power they don't basically go outside of Europe. But they are a major power in Europe, and they will quite happily humble quite a lot of people. Pascal, Clarke, can you explain me to thinking in nations like say Germany thinking Britain wouldn't join World War One if they violated Belgium's neutrality? I can't really explain that, because that's, to be honest, that's based on Germany thinking. Well, it's based on Germany looking at the British relationship with Russia and going, Russia keeps annoying Britain far more. And you have to remember, basically the Anglo-German naval race fizzles out in about 1912, 1913, it's arguably, because the Germans are giving up. They can't, whatever Tirpitz is saying mantra-wise, they can't keep up and they can't maintain it. The Royal Navy's just outbuilding everyone by that point. But the point is, the Germans are looking at the Anglo-Russian relationships and going, that's strained, and the Anglo-Russian portion of the Entente is arguably not going to be renewed at all when that was up for renewal, because of the relation, because of Russian actions in Iran/Persia and in the Far East, and in looking at India at that point. The Anglo-French relationship wasn't that great. So basically, they were looking at it and thinking, well, it's not in the British interest, is it? But the trouble is, and this is going to sound strange, it was in the British interest to stop the Germans getting too powerful in Europe, because the whole point is the British never want a major power to control the port of Antwerp. That's the major threat to Britain. That's the best place to launch an invasion of Britain from. They don't like that. There's a lesson from 1760 in this war about that. The British do not like it when the French try to gather their fleets together. This ends up with two massive naval battles, with the British beating up the Brest fleet in the Battle of Quiberon Bay and the Mediterranean fleet in the Battle of Cape Finisterre. They do this, and they still are constantly monitoring Antwerp, are constantly monitoring the Netherlands, because they worry about those ports. So whilst they're technically blockading the French ports, they also keep watches on those other ports, which are maybe French, maybe not, maybe under French control, maybe not. You know, they might be sympathetic to the French. They're still kept a watch on. So, in many ways, that's the longest standing part of the British strategic policy. We shall maintain Belgium as a small neutral power. That's our strategic philosophy. Mm-hmm. The Siege of Madras, 1758 to February 1759, which is December 1758 to February 1759, which is one of the major French offensive operations in India. And it fails. This is actually quite a heavily fortified position. That's the other point you start to think about. When you hear and think about the East India Company and what it's building in India, you have to remember the British government doesn't have to pay for this stuff. The East India Company pays for it. That's the big difference. The French East India Company, the French government keeps having to bail them out and pay for their stuff. So when you're looking at the big fortifications built by the French East India Company, they are built by the government of France. It costs money for the government. The British government, well, that's India secured, thank you. And they're not securing India from the point of view of colonial India, of ruling India. That's not the plan at this point, no matter what Clive might be dreaming of. No. It's the point is secure access for trade. You have to remember there's a reason these are all port cities. They're all trading stations. They're all places you can bring your ships into harbour, offload your goods to sell to the locals, and then take the goods of the locals, put them on your ships, and send them where else in the world you want to make a profit. That's what these things are for. If I was going to give an example, let's say this. If we're taking this in terms of modern strategy, if we were talking about, if I was using this as to discuss as historian of the present, let's say I'm advising a future space government. Okay, so we want to set up secure trading bases that we can take our trading fleets to, use as store dumps, selling points, etc. Yeah. Well, what we might want to consider is occupying planetoids or lunar objects in orbit around nearby planets. So let's say if I was of another species from another planet advising for Earth, yes, well, you see, Mars and Jupiter both have significant planets. Now, if we go and take over the lunar one on Earth, that's too close and that might cause trouble, as it could look like a threat. But if we take over one of these other ones and set up our positions on them, we're quite close to go and do the trading, and we are also far enough away. We're not considered a direct threat. That's the scenario of what these are supposed to be. So most of them, while some of them are set up in the actual big port cities that already exist in India, Others are small villages, and they build them. They build the factory, then they build a sort of, it grows, it has more people arrive, they set up walls and build a sort of town. Then they build roads that go to the local local centers of population. And these cities emerge. And the British get their own back for the siege of Madras. They go into the siege of Pondicherry. Good, awesome. Also, the border between Germany and Denmark moved at the end of World War I. Hence, Britain was attacked by Zeppelins from what is now Denmark. Mission. Port of Madras, the DS9 of the 7 Years' War. Arguably, and then you have the Siege of Pondicherry, which is the French equivalent. And you might notice this place doesn't look necessarily as well laid out as the British one. This is because, well, this is done after the siege was over. It's drawn in 1762. The siege lasted to 1761, of course. But it doesn't seem to have got rebuilt that quickly, as if the British weren't that bothered about rebuilding it. Then we have another interesting naval battle. We have the Battle of Friedrichshafen, which is between the Swedes and the Prussians. The Prussians build a navy because Frederick has given up on trying to get the Royal Navy to come and do his sea battles for him because they keep having reasons not to be there. I think one point, Frederick honestly thinks the Royal Navy's inventing new geography just to say they don't have a navy, they can't send a squadron to him. Because he's sitting there going, Pondicherry? Where is Pondicherry? Why are you sending a fleet to Pondicherry? What does Pondicherry matter to you? The Royal Navy going, it matters. It matters. We will send a mighty squadron to Pondicherry. We will. And they also have a squadron in the Caribbean. They have a squadron in Canada, squadrons various points along the French coast, a squadron which needs to sit in the North Sea for some reason, even though the Dutch aren't in the war. They have squadrons in the Mediterranean. This is poor Frederick's going, I need your navy. And George is going, well, I keep trying to send them to you, but they keep telling me they're elsewhere. Can you please keep defending Hanover for me? But anyway, this is a sort of period drawing of it. But what can I say about this battle? The Swedish win. Unsurprising when you look at the fleet being formed, but also when you consider that the training and the experience of the Swedish vessels and Swedish officers in terms of their naval force. They had one of the best navies in the Baltic. But immediately they win is when they start worrying about it and start trying to declare peace. And the reason they want to do it is that it's problematic. It's so problematic because the Swedish win, but they don't have the troops to fight and defend their position they get against the Prussian army. And so they're looking at having to fight a land war against Frederick. No one's stupid enough to want to be in a land war against Frederick. You can just about beat him when you outnumber him 3-1. Anything less, you don't want to do it. So the Swedes are going, shall we go back to what pre-war positions? No harm, no foul. Everyone happy with that? Thank you. Now, the siege of Pondicherry is, of course, going on, and as you can see, September 1759 to 1761, January 1761. To make sure the French Navy can't do much about it, the Royal Navy turns up and has a little bit of a battle. And again, it's indecisive. The Royal Navy turns up with 2 70-gun third rates and a 64-gun third rate, HMS Elizabeth, to be precise. So they've got Grafton and Yarmouth. Yarmouth is Pocock's flagship. So you wouldn't really call them the first group of the third rates either, but they are third rates and they do have 3 of them. The French have 4 third rates. The 74 gun, they have 8 third rates, honestly. They have 4 74 guns, the Censure, Comte de Provence, Minotaur, and Zurich, which is the flagship. And then they have the 64 guns, Actif, Fortune, Illustre, and Venger. So, okay, right then. They've got 8 ships. 8 major ships to the Royal Navy's 3. That's problematic. 2-1 and 4-1 numbers of superiorities. Okay, 60 guns. Let's say 4 for 8 ships of the line. What's the Royal Navy got? Tiger, Sunderland, and Weymouth. Well, that's good. Unfortunately, they're equaled by their French counterparts, which are the Duc d'Orléans, Duc de Bourgogne, and the St. Louis. Okay. What else have the British got? Oh, the 58-gun 4-for-8 ship HMS Cumberland. No French counterpart to that. And the 50-gun 4-for-8 ships HMS Newcastle and HMS Salisbury. Okay. So, theoretically, the British have 6 4-for-8s against the France's 3 4-for-8s. But the trouble is, the French have 8 third rates to their 3 third rates. So, even if the 4-for-8s are able to bump up a little bit, theoretically, and I say this theoretically, the French outnumber them 11-9. So they have 2 more ships to the line. Okay, let's hope frigates are good. The British have the 20-gun 6-for-8 frigate HMS Queenborough. And the French have the Sylphide and the Diligent. That's just not a good force. That's not a good force for anyone. Scenarios. So, hang on. But I said the siege succeeds. The French force outnumbers them in frigates 2-1, and in ships of the line 11-9, and they're heavier, bigger ships, so they have more cannon. Well, why are the British even attacking the French in the first place? And how come the French don't win it? Well, this is one of those interesting scenarios. The reason the British are attacking, it's a spoiling fight. It's designed to cause damage. They are basically sailing in, sailing out. They're not there to do a standing fight with the French. And if you look at this design and this line out, you can see exactly what we mean. The whole point is the English go in, they blast, they get out. And they provide cover, therefore, for the besieging forces to carry on their siege, which stops the French naval forces being able to relieve the siege. If the French naval forces can't relieve the siege, then it keeps on going, and eventually the French in Pondicherry run out of supplies. And when they run out of supplies, you win. I was asking, what's a half galley? It's a sort of combination of a sail and galley ship. It's got some oars, but it's also sort of galley sail dependent. On your recommendation, I took a look at the Swedish Empire. How did Sweden invade territory in Africa? Because the Swedish Vikings never ever downed the Swedish ability to end up with territory in random places. So in a quick little jam back, pretty much. And then the British follow up with the Battle of Quiberon Bay, which basically causes the French to go, ah! Use that, but that's basically what the French are going. Battle of Finisterre, Battle of Quiberon Bay, and it's a case of why are you so nasty to me? Because in 1761 they managed to lose a ship of the line at the Battle of Cape Finisterre. Maybe it's in a battle, one-on-one battle with another ship of the line, but it was one ship of the line and one frigate versus one ship of the line and two frigates, and the British was the smaller force and won. But when you have the Battle of Quiberon Bay, in 1759, the French, the British start off with 24 ships of the line and 5 frigates. They have 2 ships of the line wrecked. And of course, this is that famous battle where British seamanship goes really, really through the fricking roof to get them in there. The French start off with 21 ships of the line and 6 frigates, so they're slightly ahead in frigates, but they're behind in ships of the line. So the British, even when they've lost 2, are still ahead by 1. Trouble is, the French lose 6 destroyed and 1 captured. The British have 400 killed. The French have 2,500. And there's also the Battle of Lagos, which is where Edward Boscan, and it's basically this combined fight, the Battle of Lagos, this combined fight, which sort of takes place in August 1759. I'm not sure if I did cover it, but that's under the command of Boscawen. And that's 15 ships of the line and 10 frigates, 2 sloops, and 2 fireships versus a French fleet of 12 ships of the line and 3 frigates. And unsurprisingly, the French lose. They get 2 ships of the line captured, destroyed, and 3 ships of the line captured. And that is how Britain puts paid to the 1760 attempt of invading Britain. Because in 1759, they wipe out the Mediterranean fleet as an effective force, because the Mediterranean fleet limps home with 1,000 killed and wounded. And it wipes out the Channel fleet, the Brest fleet, with 2,500 killed and 7 ships lost. This is also the battle where should point out that this Lagos is one of the first battles which, one of many battles which is added onto the good old HMS Warspite's history and career. Basically, this is the first big war where Britain worries as a nation about French invasion in terms and takes it seriously, but also where they employed a strange strategy they would employ later on at various points in the Revolutionary Wars, and of course most famously Trafalgar Napoleonic Wars, in that they will have fleets they will cover the French fleet separately, and if they come out to sea, fight them. And it's same places again and again. Lagos is one of those places, you have a fight, you can. Let me get this up, because this is what I wanted to talk about, the planned invasion of Britain. Because it's all the plan, the baby-faced Duke de Choiseul, a very baby-faced gentleman. But it's one of those sort of interesting points. It becomes one of those standard things in history, when we consider it, that there will be battles in this particular area. That's annoying. Give me a second. That button. Sorry, the thing I'd saved earlier and was supposed to come up decided not to work and not to come up. Joy of technology. But while I'm fixing that, I will answer questions. Vision. HMS Charles Galley, 1676, was an old frigate that served till 1744 after several rebuilds. She is they did. There was a fair number of other ones as well, which got certain usages out of them. Back cascading. Hello, Dr. Clarke. It seems all Britain's opponents get the worst of it when it comes to naval engagements. Are there any nations that held their own against the might of the British Navy well throughout history? No, they've all had points of it, but the point is normally is this: for Britain, fighting its navy is its first line of defence and its critical force. For other nations, navies are something they choose to do. How do I put this blank? For France, having a navy is a statement of power. It's a statement of intent. It's something which is very useful for showing their power and showing their intent. But it's not necessary to themselves and to their survival. Their army is necessary to their survival. Whereas for Britain, the Royal Navy is necessary to its survival. The Royal Navy is felt to be critical to its survival. So it will put in the money. It will go the extra mile. It will do whatever's necessary to keep that force going. And that's the difference. So the others will grow strong. They'll invest in the navies for a time. And they might challenge the British, and they might be successful in a battle. There's always the chance they're going to be successful, and there's always a chance they'll win. But the thing is, at certain points, they will find they can't afford to carry it on because they have to focus in back again on the army, or they have other issues which they have to focus in on. And so it falls apart. And the Royal Navy carries on. And that's the point. It's the Royal Navy isn't divine providence, best in the world all the time. The Royal Navy is what it is because of stubbornness, persistence, and commitment. And again, that's the difference when you're dealing with anyone else, really. That's the difference. The Royal Navy will get the support. The others won't. That's the problem for the army. In many ways, the British Army is kind of Britain's equivalent to the French Navy, in that they are great. But they don't get the funding the Navy does through history. They don't get the consistently. As well as the Army does, and the Army often does very, very well, it never gets the same level of support as the Navy has. And this is the point I'm going to make. The Battle of Lagos. Planned invasion of Britain, October 1760, where it stopped. Well, there's the capital of St. Vincent. There's also the capital of... there's also the Cape St. Vincent. There's Cape Trafalgar. Cadiz, Lagos, Strait of Gibraltar. And there you go. Where battles so often happen. Where they really do often happen. And mainly because that's a good place for the fleets to come together. But it's also a good place for you to find your enemy because... how do I put this? You have two choices. Due to the currents and the winds, you can either go out to sea, in which case you're going out and you're going transatlantic, or you have to sort of hug the coast. And if you have to hug the coast, well, then you're not going anywhere. Be back in a second. Someone just made a noise outside and I think I'm needed. Sorry. Coming. Stretch. It fallen over again. Yes. Come. I'm going to have to get Drac and some concrete involved in that. Possibly some steel rebar as well. That'll do. I don't know. But no. That's the Battle of Lagos. And basically, the lovely Duke de Choiseul comes up with this great idea. Brilliant idea. We're not winning on land in Europe, and we're not winning around the world because the British are able to continue fighting without their land being ravaged by an army. If we can get an army to Britain, we'll win. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to combine our fleets. We're going to bring our Mediterranean fleet around to Brest. They're going to form up with the fleet at Brest, and two fleets together. They are going to control the channel while an army crosses to descend on Britain. They will march on London, and we will win. Where have we heard that one before? How many times in history have we heard that one before? A lot. Random question. Titanic hits the iceberg. German steamship asks if they can help. Britain radio operator tells them to go away. I've never heard that before in my life. So, I don't think so. I don't think anyone would have been told them to go away. There is always the fantastical thing that there might have been a ship closer that didn't answer hails, and that may have been German, may not have been, may have been American, may have been British. No one knows. But we'll see. German, so this would be basically the main fight. Oh, sorry for being quiet. No, I mean, don't mean quiet. Yeah. Basically, the main fights take place at sea. If we put this up again. The planned invasion of Britain is defeated by these two battles. Lagos and Quiberon Bay. If I design it right, that should fit. Yeah, I did get it right. So, and they planned to invade Britain in 1760. To do that, they have to get their navy together. In August 1759, the Mediterranean fleet is beaten up. And they thought, well, we can still do this with the Brest fleet. The Brest fleet is a mighty fleet. Because this was only 15 ships. That was 21. That's 21, that's enough. And Hawke does a Hawke. Oh, we can't. We've gone away. You're coming out. Oh, goody. They come out. They don't go back again. Or rather, they try and get into Quiberon Bay to get away from the British, and the British actually get into Quiberon Bay as quickly, if not quicker, than some of the French units. And it's just not a good scenario for them. That's exactly. Why do people overlook naval aspect of wars before the 20th century? I don't think they do. Judging, there are lots and lots of good books about the naval aspect of wars before the 20th century. I think a lot of focus gets put into land warfare because it tends to be How do I put this politely? If you go on campaign in an army, especially if you're a diarist riding home, you're going to have something to talk about most days. Because the army's going to be moving forward. It's going to be scouting. It's going to be doing daring do and bravery. If you're the Royal Navy, you have these big battles, yes, but most of the time you're doing convoy duty or you're sitting off Brest, Rochefort, Toulon, Cadiz, Lagos, and watching and going, gonna come out and fight soon? Anytime soon? No? Okay. Left sails are moving. Are they coming out? No. Oh. We got a lot of flags and trumpets going on. Perhaps they're coming out. No. Oh. The fox is annoying the Tafra quite greatly. Santa Canero, putting that pot somewhere else, not in the running path of the fox, would be an idea. Apart from, my mum has this idea that the pot will block the fox if we make it heavy enough. John Murray, couldn't Mahan have seen what happened to the Prussian Navy and gone, if the US had that, we'll lose quickly? Well, yes, but also he did have the lesson of the War of 1812, where the Americans had a fine navy right up until the point at which the British started deploying a lot more solid forces, and then it was a case of ew, oh. Hmm. Let's look at the American Revolution as HMS Montana, a sick freight Aegis sail warship, and how she sank as the loss was a victory for the US. Not sure. Shamak, I saw a meme where it was the Wikipedia battle box for Jutland with the winner section changed to the publishing industry victory. What other battles could be characterized this way? Basically, any battle you declare indecisive will tend to be argued over. The Battle of Minden. Definitely. So anyway, at what point do they run out of places in that region to name battles after? Oh well, they have lots of battles in that region which are named after places, and they can have you can be named after a place more than once. They can name battle after a place more than once, so you can have a fair number of them. I think there's more than one battle of Trafalgar. I think there's definitely more than one battle of Lagos. Let me just check. Yeah, the Battle of Lagos, there is the 1693 battle as well as the 1759 battle. You know, we have these fun things. The 1693 Battle Lagos is France versus England and the Dutch Republic under command of George Rooke, and it's a French victory, but it's 70 ships. The French have 70 ships of the line versus the Anglo-Dutch force of 16 ships of the line and 200 merchantmen. Wow, that must have been a fun battle. But that area is just, yeah. fun for it. But again, it's the thing about the 7 Years' War is it sets up a lot of what's going to happen in later wars. It really does. Set up a lot of the content, and it sets up a lot of the standard practices we're going to see. Because it starts the paradigm of Britain going, we hire the Prussians to do our fighting for us on land and keep the French busy on land because they have to. Because the Royal Navy going around the world is not a direct threat to France. But the Prussian army is a direct threat to France, so they have to concentrate them. They have to supply their army to go and fight them. And while we're doing that, we can go and take off some nice, rich French colonies. Okay. Guys, 5 minutes late. Was the Duke de Choiseul the one that Catherine the Great mentioned as an insolent puppy? I think Catherine the Great was quite rude about him. He was a favourite of Madame de Pompadour. But this is the classic thing is he is the foreign minister and pretty much acting prime minister, although they don't have that role in the French government, who comes up with these plans, but he also is never informed by Louis XV about Louis XV's secret foreign policy going on. So the poor guy is constantly trying to do foreign policy without realizing that his own king is not actually doing the foreign policy he's claiming he's doing. And he's the foreign minister. So he's basically the guy in charge of of implementing what he thinks is Louis' foreign policy, but isn't actually Louis' foreign policy. It's Louis' public foreign policy. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Runcash must have been painful for the RN to sink so many of their reserve fleet ships at Quiron Bay. Possibly. Afro, can you recommend any good books about naval aspect of 100 Years' War? Or would you find this in a broader spectrum book about a particular stage of the 100 Years' War? Okay, I'm presuming you mean the first 100 Years' War, and it tends to be in the broader aspects because most of the naval actions in the 100 Years' War are boarding actions and they are fought like armies. I've done some videos on them. They are quite horrific casualties for all involved. Well, mainly for the French, it seems, at one point. There are certain English kings who really do take to the idea of naval warfare as oh, good, we've got them trapped in something. We've got longbowmen, and we can then board and hurt them. That's good. And whilst the other side are going, we are in big heavy armor. Yes, but even worse than marching on bog, that's water. You go into it, you drown. We didn't think about this one. We have to get out of our armor. Why do you English have lighter armor? Jonathan Burrow, I think you mean the Californian ship. I would honestly have to do some more research to check on that one. I haven't read the stuff on the Titanic for a while. I've been doing other stuff. And also, there's the fact that of the merchant ships which get sunk in icy waters, I tend to be more interested in the armed merchant cruisers than poor Titanic. Nine six eight three one. I'm not rising to that sort of comment on you've done to on that one, but I would say I don't. The fairy swordfish doesn't start from a Greek Navy requirement. You can go back, as I've done with the tracing of the the Blackburn Company and the Fairy Company back to through the various there's aircraft designs, etc., which do start to facilitate up to the swordfish, but I wouldn't class it as going back to a Greek Navy requirement. So I'm not sure where that one comes from, but I would be very interested to see someone trying to justify that one. All right, the capture of Belle Isle. Yes, well, that's if any of you know where Belle Isle is, and I will show you. Right. So, the British decide that they have a problem. They want to blockade Saint Nazaire area, the Rochefort area, La Rochelle area, sort of thing, La Rochelle, Rochefort, and they also want to keep an eye on Brest. And it becomes problematic in winter what you're going to do. So, they come up with what must be one of the most wicked of wicked wheezes. And that is this. If I can get it up again. Come on, Belial. Come on, you can come on. Come on, work. Yay! Sorry. XSplit is having a bit of a go slow on me, so it's occasionally being a bit problematic and taking its time to pop these things up in the right order. I do apologize. It's done most of the show fairly well, so I'm not too worried about it. But it is now going, I'm hot. That's a good one. That's from, well, as said, I would be very interested in how I justify it, because that was my PhD thesis, was in large chunk around the development of the of various swordfish and various other aircraft, and no, There are probably the, as I said, you can trace back certain elements to certain to other aircraft designs, some of which, well, as I said in my own videos, were modified and sold to various things for the Greek Navy. So there are a lot of. I would have to watch it myself to see what they exactly say, because in my experience, military aviation history usually is pretty darn correct. But the swordfish doesn't come from Greek specification, not to my knowledge. And well, there's always the possibility that I am wrong, but I am doubtful on this one. There you go. There is Belle Isle. As you can see, it's a rather cool place. If you want to control it, it does help you blockade the French coast. And the Royal Navy's policy is always better to fight the war against on your opponent's coast. It's like it's always, if the army was asked, they'd always say it's better to fight a war in the enemy's territory rather than your own. Bannon, are there any lessons learned on ship designs throughout time that we might end up relearning in the future war? That you do need amphibious transport, and it does have to be specific. And whilst not specialized shipping, you do need dedicated shipping for it. And these days, that equates to specialized shipping because of what you need to transport. In those time, most of the transport was blokes, just infantry regiments who were self-propelled. When you took horses, that was actually far more difficult. In fact, often the reason why the British Army becomes such an infantry-focused force is the Navy just goes, do you realise how difficult it is to move a cavalry regiment around? And the Army's going, sorry, stop being nasty to me and looking at me that way. We'll do it with infantry. Can we take some artillery? Yes, but only limited. You need big guns, you can borrow some of ours. Basically, that's the experience of the 7 Years' War. The poor army getting the army having lots of grand schemes and getting bullied by the Navy on occasion. We're not getting into that technological debate about where our aircraft are. So that's the capture of Belle Isle, which is a very nice little thing. The British capture it. And to be fair, the British sort of occupy the island, return it in 1763 for the due to the Treaty of Paris. But it took a while for the French to realise they wanted the island back, because this shows you some of the problems of the French strategic thinking. And honestly, I think this does feed into some of the German positions in terms of, especially Dogger Bank, etc., their various islands. The initial French reaction was to go, well, if the British wanted it, they could keep it, but expect no compensation if they handed it back. But once they realised that it would become a base of privateers and the Royal Navy to attack France, the Treaty of Paris hands it back, and in return for this little tiny island, Britain gets Majorca. Yeah. Oh, that's what this place was worth to Britain. Britain was only prepared to give this back for Minorca, which is a lovely island in the massive island Mediterranean, which allows them to do similar things to the French in the Mediterranean. But that's considered less of a problem than the British having this tiny island sitting right on their Atlantic coast. It's bad enough with Jersey and Guernsey without having this one as well. Oh. Man, it was not educate bullying. It was educating the small service in its manners. It was, I have to say the capture is quite disturbing because it's two landings. The expedition assembles in Plymouth. It arrives in March 1761. They're delayed by bad weather, so they get there eventually in April. They aim to get there in March, but they get there in April because they're delayed by bad weather. They do a reconnaissance of the island. They decide the southern area around Port Andro is probably the best. The forces landed under General John Crawford. A feint was made to the north with 2 battalions of infantry and a contingent of His Majesty's Marines, not Royal Marines at this point. Remember, they're not Royal Marines till 1802. So at this point, they're just Marines. And tries to divert the attention of the French from Crawford. However, the French were well entrenched. They have a company of they try and fire at the British. They're trying to resist the British. And eventually the British have to sort of withdraw. The French are really upset that this went on because there were peace talks going on and the British were still launching a strike. They regarded as an act of bad faith. The British were annoyed that it took them so long to do it. However, Pitt ordered a second attempt. And more troops, which had been carrying troops planning to take part in an attack on Martinique, were diverted to join Keppel, along with other significant reinforcements, to actually carry it out. A second landing goes better. In fact, the British found that a patch of the coast around St. Foy was completely undefended, as the French believed that the high cliffs were strong enough against any attack that nothing else mattered. The British managed to get ashore. The French withdrew into the main fortification of Le Palais, leaving the rest of the island to invaders. The British now occupied the ports, allowing them to ship in fresh supplies, troops, and everything else they needed to besiege Le Palais. And Chevalier Saint-Croix, the French commander, hoped that he would get support, and the French governor of Brittany, Duc d'Orléans, gathered a force at Vannes. The trouble is, the Royal Navy stopped them being reinforced. Keppel, good old Admiral Keppel, keeps them well at bay and well under control. And so, after a month of siege, Saint-Croix has to capitulate. And the British very kindly repatriated his force to nearby Lorient, mainly because that got them away from them. It meant they couldn't cause any trouble. It's always good to do this. There are some other small actions. There's the action of 17th July 1761 and other events which take place, which go into war. And you have to remember, a lot of the naval actions of this war don't get reported because in the big histories because they are frigate actions. There are lots and lots of frigate fights. There are lots of convoy fights, which will never with privateers, which don't make the big history. They are the meat and bone, and they're the meat and bones of this war. But they don't get, meat and muscle of this war. But the bone, we talk about the bones, which are the big battles. And so that's the legacy of this war. That's like the 7 Years' War. It has so many operations going on. It's got so much as part of it. The last real action that we tend to talk about, if it comes up, is the Battle of Cape Finisterre, which I mentioned earlier, where you've got one British frigate holding off two French frigates while a British ship of the line engages a French ship of the line in roughly equal strength. The British ship of the line wins. The two French frigates go away because, frankly, they're not getting past the British frigate, and now they've got to deal with a ship of the line. They don't want to get involved in that. This is a legacy of what's to come. The British are starting to rely on professionalism to make up for weakness of force. They want to have as strong a force as they can, but they realize they can either have a mass force or they can have a highly professional force, but both are going to cost money. And this is why they start focusing in money long-term onto the Navy. And really do focus it in long-term. We've talked about Pepys, we talk about all the reformers of earlier years, but this is where it really starts to take off after the 7 Years' War. It's where you've got a lot of officers who are committed to professionalizing the naval officer corps, to professionalizing their training, to professionalizing the training of sailors and the standardization of things between ships. And the shipyards and the dockyards are starting to get better and better. They won't necessarily ever get quick at supplying ships. Dockyards never work as quickly as the Admiralty would like them to. But they supply good quality ones. And you have to remember, while they're building new ships, they tend to be repairing a lot of older ships as well, and doing what are sometimes called major refits, and major repairs, which is basically, for you and I speak, a completely new ship comes out, but it's got the old name on it, and maybe some of the wood somewhere. So we are almost at the end of tonight's live. I hope you've enjoyed the 7 Years' War. I know it's been a bit of a flick through because roughly 20 battles, I think it's been over, I mentioned. And that's not all of them, that's just the major ones. And I had to be pretty brutal to make it to that level. But the point I'm trying to make is the reason they start off with the 7 Years' War is it is a global war and it is all these things. But also, it's got so much going on, you can make the case for anything. Which is both a good and a bad thing. Because the point you have to remember as strategy is it's not a zero-sum game, and it's also not a one-size-fits-all game. The strategy that's best for America is not necessarily the strategy that's best for Britain, is not necessarily the strategy that's best for France, is not necessarily the best strategy for America or the strategy for China. You cannot assume your opponent is operating on the same strategy as you or to the same strategic thinking as you. You can't presume their priorities are the same as yours. Your strategy is going to be defined by your priorities and your strategic circumstances. A nation tends to get into trouble when it starts to think it has to act like other nations and think like other nations in terms of their strategy. Because they don't. The strategic scenario of America is very different to anyone else. The strategic scenario of Britain is very different to anyone else. The strategic scenario of Brazil is massively different to the strategic scenario of Bolivia. And they are. There's nothing wrong with that. There is nothing right with that. It's just a fact. So, the 7 Years' War, the other reason that so many different strategies come out of the 7 Years' War is because you have all these different officers, all these different people, historians, theorists, some of them, writing their ideas, but they're looking at it from their own nation's perspective, and they're often looking at it from the perspective and context of their own national needs at the time. So if I was writing a history of the 7 Years' War now, and let's say I imagined myself to be a historian of the present, i.e. a theorist or strategist, then the angle I'd be looking at would be very different than if I was, let's say, Jamie Armored Carriers, Jamie Seedorf. Great guy, great historian. Let's say he was writing it, and he was considering himself a historian of the present and writing it on 7 Years' War. Because if he's writing it from what the lessons the Australian government should take, and the Australian government should learn in its thinking, he would be very different to what I would write for the British government and the British body politic to take from it. And very different from what my friend Benjamin Armstrong, BJ, who works in the US Naval Academy, great historian. I've got, where's his book? His books. I've got one of his books around here because I'm using it. I'm going to be talking about him on Sunday. Yeah, 21st Century Mahan. He's also got one on Sims. Both excellent books, well worth reading. But his way of writing about 7 Years' War will be very different to mine, very different to James, because if he was talking about himself as a historian of the present. Which is also something you have to think about when you're reading those histories. Okay? Sure, Mike. So this is when the Royal Navy starts to really develop a deep the sense of esprit de corps. I would argue the 7 Years' War does have a bigger factor in that. They're starting it before it, but it's where it starts to cement it. It's also where, of course, Bing gets hung, so that is usually used as a bit of a watershed moment for the Royal Navy. Dutchman? I don't want to butcher his name. Were there any RN officers who participated in many wars and battles and were wounded a ridiculous number of times and they survived? Oh, so many of them. Right, around Cash. I'm going to start talking about questions. As there was questions earlier about what's coming on next week. 9th of December is going to be Patron 39, so that's up to the patron vote. The 5th December is the Writing Theorists, Corbett, Mahan, Richmond, Sims, Kurtable, and Korshkov. So I'm looking at those 6 specifically. Pearl Harbor, a product of the Kantai-Kessen Doctrine or Something to Do, is my 7th of the 7th video. Don't take this the wrong way, because it's a great thing. Drac did such a brilliant video last year on Pearl Harbor and the work done afterwards to recover and repair the ships. That's just amazing. So I'm not touching anywhere near that topic because I just don't want the comparisons to be drawn, because I'm nowhere near his skill of putting together videos yet. I'm a couple of years behind him on that one, and he's getting better all the time as well, which doesn't help. He just keeps getting better and better and working harder and harder. So, nicest way. Doesn't stand still for me to catch up. Could do a guy a favor, but it's good because I love his videos. But this is why one of the reasons I'm concentrating on the product of Kantai-Kessen Doctrine or Something to Do is my 7th of December video. And I hope you enjoyed that one. And this will probably come out as a long patrol because I think it's been kind of popular. I wasn't expecting quite so many questions. So I hope it has been enjoyable. Johanna, you might even find different within the UK ways of writing about 7 Years' War. Well, yes, if you're trying to make the case for a stronger army, you might write about it different than if you're trying to make a case for a stronger navy. And these are the Patreon vote December vote topics. Remember, the vote is live on Patreon. There's also, if you want to pick one of these, go to the Tessa Fronga video, and whichever one gets the most votes but isn't selected by patron will be turned into a special live between Christmas and New Year, which I haven't put the date up for yet because, well, we have Brewship 66 on Boxing Day, and then we have the 30th of December we have a live, so probably it will be the 28th. Probably it will be the 28th. That'll be fun. Let's check my dates. No, Brewship 66. Brewships will be the 30th of December. Will be the 28th. Brewship 66? Oh, yeah. I'll work that one out. Yeah. I'll work out dates. I'm just sort of remembering something else as well I was supposed to be adding in there. I know. Hope you enjoyed it all. Thank you very much. And last questions, because I should probably get going and go walk puppies. If it's warm enough to walk them. I'm not sure what the temperature is outside. Let me just check. It's looking a bit cold for my puppy dogs. Yeah, they don't tend to like it that cold. We'll see. Well, next time Drax and you go sword fighting in episode 9, so you can take care of him, always putting ahead of you. I wouldn't do that. Besides, he is very good with a sword. Take care of it, Vasava. Thank you, Graham Hander. Thank you, Vision, Knight6831. Thank you, Jonathan Burrow. Thank you, Peter Dawson. Thank you, MC Legend 13H. Hope you would catch up on the stream. Thank you, Ryan Cash. Rapid Raise Back. Dutchman. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, DG40. Thank you. Ooh. Take care, Alfiro. Thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed them. Thank you, Cascadian. Hello, I haven't seen you in a while to say hello to in the chat, so thank you. Hello, Carl. Thank you, Carl Van Gasberg. I think I said that, but I'll done that again. Thank you, Seneca Nero. Thank you, Rosowski. Hello. Thank you, Sean V. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Alpsowski, thank you. Take care. Take care, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.